Somewhere between Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker, a couple of fantastic little Zelda titles, developed by Capcom of all companies, would end up taking shape on the Game Boy Color. These two games would end up hitting store shelves as a dual release, two sister games that would be intrinsically connected to form one larger Zelda experience. This is the Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, a pair of frankly incredible Zelda games with a run of 19 story dungeons between them. It would be easy to look at these similar color-coded box arts and titles and assume that this was the Zelda series following suit after the success of Pokemon. However, Pokemon's dual releases are two versions of the same game. That is not the case here. These are two unique Zelda titles, each comparable in length to Link's Awakening. They feature entirely different stories, villains, overworld settings, dungeons, items, characters, and even gameplay philosophies, with Seasons having more of an action focus, while Ages maintains an emphasis on puzzles. They are connected, but entirely separate beasts. I can't stress this enough. These are just two entire, complete games. Their connectivity is what sets them apart, however. The idea was to play one after the other, in the order of your choosing. After the end of your first adventure, you would receive a password to input at the start of the next, allowing certain elements to carry over to whichever adventure you tackled second, ultimately leading you to the duology's true ending. So I know I just said these were two independent Zelda titles, but they are best enjoyed as two halves of a larger experience, whereas their Pokemon contemporaries will offer a pretty complete experience with just one or the other version. You only need Pokemon Red or Blue, but you will definitely want to enjoy both Ages and Seasons. Hopefully I'm making sense. Now, with all of that context, I wanted to address the order in which I am choosing to cover these two games and their dungeons for this series. I am choosing to complete Oracle of Seasons first, followed by Oracle of Ages. While I've heard that the opposite order offers more story closure for side quests, well, this isn't a lore video. It is a level design analysis video, and when looking at the two games as a larger whole, it is important to me that I take the overall difficulty curve into account. To put it bluntly, Oracle of Ages is a significantly more difficult game than Seasons, which is probably why I prefer Ages between the two. So while you can play them in either order, I think it makes the most sense from a dungeon design dissection standpoint to look at the easier Seasons first. I'll refer you to this great video by my pal Nehru for a little more on that subject. He explains it pretty in depth, but my own reasoning for this series can be summed up by this graph he made about the difficulty of these games' dungeons. Though on a more personal note, in my own previous playthroughs of these games, I have only ever played Ages then Seasons, so doing this order of Seasons first, then Ages is a nice little excuse for me to try something a little different on this playthrough. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's hop into things. Beckoned by the Triforce, Link finds himself thrown into the land of Holodrum. After being rescued by the dancer Din and her troupe, danger follows closely behind our hero. General Onox appears, swatting the troupe and Link aside before capturing Din, who is the titular Oracle of Seasons. With the Oracle imprisoned and her temple buried, Holodrum's seasons are thrown into chaos. After arming himself, Link consults the wise Maku Tree, who tasks him with tracking down the 8 essences of nature, the closest of which is found in a gnarled root just north of Horon Village. The Maku Tree gives Link the key to this all too familiar entrance, unlocking the first dungeon. Welcome to the Gnarled Root Dungeon, which finds itself in a bit of an interesting, if not difficult, position. It has to strike a balance between being this game's first full dungeon, while also maybe being the 10th dungeon that you complete in the game's duology after you've already got the likes of the notorious Jabu Jabu under your belt. Gnarled Root has to straddle the line between being simple enough to be a starter dungeon, but also engaging enough for players to continue on the path that they may have left off with after ages. And I'm happy to report that it pulls this off with at least relative success. One way this is achieved is by supplementing some of the game's tutorialization with the Hero's Cave. If you take on Seasons first, then the Hero's Cave will offer you a short mini-dungeon that teaches you the very basics of the dungeon crawling experience before you set foot in this place, solving very basic puzzles to unlock shutter doors and spawn a treasure chest, as well as requiring a single small key to make progress, all before rewarding you with a sword. It's the bare basics, but it is essentially a wordless tutorial on how dungeons work, and that burden of having to teach the player ends up offloaded from Gnarled Root. So if you're tackling Seasons second, then, well, you already have enough dungeon knowledge to have gotten through ages. So this is unnecessary. The game instead starts you off with the sword, and the Hero's Cave tutorial is entirely skipped, allowing Gnarled Root to come out of the deal unmodified, regardless of which game order you choose. All of that said, I do feel it works better as a first dungeon than a 10th. As previously mentioned, in all my previous playthroughs of these games, I have done Seasons second, and as such have always found Gnarled Root to be rather unremarkable. It's not bad, it's just not great either. A mid-tier dungeon. But examining it as the first dungeon instead has made me appreciate it a lot more. For a first dungeon, it is of decent size, spanning the equivalent of 19 full-sized rooms, or 20 if you count this side-scrolling room where we get the dungeon item. I say equivalent of because some of these rooms are actually larger chambers that take up the same amount of space as 2 standard-sized rooms, but they're still registered on the dungeon map in equal-sized tiles. So essentially the map screen counts this as 2 rooms, even though looking at the actual structure during gameplay shows that it is clearly one large room. Speaking of rooms, let's talk about the architecture. Aesthetically, it's just okay. It has green brick walls and brownish floor tiles, which make for a decent, earthy color palette. It resembles Key Cavern quite a bit in the architecture. These games are, of course, built off the back of Link's Awakening DX, which is not a bad thing, mind you, but the reused assets are nothing to write home about. There's only so much you can do visually on the Game Boy Color, though, so I'm willing to cut them a lot of slack here. There are still small little touches here and there to give the dungeon some personality. They use red and blue tiles to mark important areas and provide some visual flair. When most of the dungeon has this flagstone floor pattern, a room early on that has these vibrant reds is going to stick out in my memory, which is good, since that's the critical path towards the dungeon boss, gated by a puzzle that you can't yet complete. Using the architecture itself to offer landmarks that are vital to the gameplay is great, and while Gnarled Root isn't exactly complex, including a nice visual element like that can allow even the most complicated dungeons to feel just a little more understandable at a glance, so it's good to see it included as early as this. The music, meanwhile, is pretty mediocre here. It isn't the most grating, but it isn't anywhere near as moody as something like Tail Cave's theme or the Light World dungeon theme from A Link to the Past, though it's sounds a little incidental. In some ways, it makes it feel a little like this sort of dungeon crawling is just business as usual for Link, which works for me honestly. It's just not that catchy or particularly memorable. Structurally, I guess the music can be compared to Tail Cave in that it alternates between a sort of curious section and then a dangerous sounding section. Which conceptually is perfect for dungeon music, but this one just doesn't resonate with me the same way that track did. Still, this is far from either the worst or best that this soundtrack has to offer. The second portion of the song is musically far more interesting to me than the first. And well, if it were only that first portion of the song on loop, I think I would rate this track even more critically, but that second part kind of balances it out. What I like about Gnarled Root as a starter dungeon is the way it is unafraid to wordlessly let you try things out and learn for yourself. After the foyer, the dungeon immediately branches in 3 directions, and while the north route only has a hint-giving old man, the other 2 are vital for progression, with the east path being that one that leads towards the boss, and the west route pretty well containing the rest of the dungeon. That said, you are required to at least head east first to grab the key to that western door, which will tease you with a door we can't open in this room, which I mentioned earlier with that red path. This is something the dungeon does well a couple of times, trailing you past things you can't do yet while on your way through the dungeon. In this case, these unlit torches that seasoned Zelda players will undoubtedly take a mental note of. There's some simple Zelda 1 style push block mechanisms to open doors, as well as a more complicated push block maze to get through. The dungeon spreads its keys and locked doors out quite nicely as well. There are only 2 small keys, but they're placed in areas that demand you explore thoroughly, and then are supplemented later by item gating, which is a great balance to have. Overall, the exploration here is fairly straightforward, if you're able to take note of your surroundings and use the old process of elimination effectively. This dungeon shouldn't stump you, but it's also not really meant to. We're only at the start of the game after all. It'll block you with a locked or sealed door here and there, but there will always be a second path to explore and find the means to eventually open every room. Frankly, this is a solid progression structure, making use of forks in the road, locks and keys, and explorable space very well. A neat feature that I'm surprised to see make such an early debut in this game is the set of minecart tracks found in this central area of the dungeon. These are always neat set pieces, and mechanically will transport you from a source area to a predetermined destination with a built-in switch in the tracks that you can toggle with a nearby lever to change course. It's not exactly groundbreaking stuff, but it is put to good use here, especially since you're locked into that course once you hop in. There's no getting out of the cart until it stops at the end, which adds a fun little wrinkle to the navigation in a couple of rooms. It makes it feel like pushing forward is a greater commitment. The map and compass are placed pretty well here too. The map is found pretty early on in this room. The compass, meanwhile, is tucked on this ledge, which isn't too hidden, but is potentially missable if you're being hasty. And I could totally imagine someone not spotting it until they're already in the minecart below, riding past here. The compass retains its jingle feature from Link's Awakening as well, which I'm a huge fan of, honestly. I'm not sure why this never became the standard. Maybe it's because later games would just give you the minimap instead. The map itself, meanwhile, feels far more functional in this game than Link's Awakening, being given its own dedicated map screen like most games have, rather than this corner of your inventory screen that Link's Awakening gave it. It's a small change, but it feels like such an improvement, and brings it more in line with games like A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. Of course, our path through the dungeon will ultimately take us to the northernmost room, where we'll encounter the mid-boss. This is apparently be a pair of boomerang-wielding Gorias. Though they look pretty different from the other Gorias if you ask me. These are called the Brother Gorias, and when I described them as boomerang-wielding, I do mean a singular boomerang between the two of them. They're no slouches, especially for the first mid-boss, but it's nothing unmanageable. Though the way they use formations around Link is pretty interesting, it doesn't feel challenging enough for this concept to really be realized. Oh well, defeating them will lead us towards the dungeon item, a seed satchel containing Ember Seeds, essentially Link's very own fire starter kit. Functionally, it's the same as either the candle from the original Zelda or the magic powder from Link's Awakening, allowing us to burn flammable objects and light torches. This gets put to use right away. The mid-bosses will spawn a portal, like they always did in Link's Awakening, but rather than teleporting you to the dungeon entrance, it loops you back to this room where we can try out our new equipment, lighting these torches to open this door and get the boss key. Then we can use it again in this room where we got our first small key earlier, which will take us towards the boss itself. If I'm being honest, I was a little surprised about where the portal dropped me off at first, but doing it this way makes learning to use the item feel that much more intuitive and streamlined, without them needing to lock you in the room to teach you how the item works. The seed satchel itself doesn't sound like the most exciting of dungeon items, but setting fires is fun, and it's going to be absolutely vital for the rest of the game. Plus, we also find bombs in here and can get a shield from the village before the dungeon, so it feels like the game is already starting to stack our inventory with versatile equipment early on, which I certainly don't mind. So once we've gotten our Ember Seeds and nabbed the boss key, there's one final little maze area to get through, avoiding the wall masters as we do, and we can head towards the dungeon boss. Dropping with a thud, will be halted by Aquamentus. Yeah, like that Aquamentus, marking his only ever return in the series since the original Legend of Zelda. Great to see you, Aquamentus. He looks great here. A clear carryover from his NES design, but with a great deal of added detail that makes him look far more menacing. And he actually uses both his wings and horn in this game. This is a short but pretty fun first boss, and a huge glow up for the iconic Unicorn Dragon. As he did in the original game, he will attack by launching projectiles at you, but now he will also fly to avoid your attacks and charge at you with an aggressive, impaling melee attack. There isn't any use for your newly acquired Ember Seeds here, and from my testing, he's even immune to damage from bombs, it seems. So instead, this fight requires you to focus on maintaining the correct positioning and strike his head to deal damage. He also now has some nice telegraphing before his attacks, with his horn glowing before he shoots those projectiles. Between that and the way your own sword attacks swipe instead of just being a straight stab, all of these added elements just makes the fight feel a little fairer and, for lack of better words, less spammy. It's not really that difficult, but it's a nice set piece. And, well, as I've said repeatedly, a first boss shouldn't really be that challenging. It's more about teaching players the gameplay flow and laying groundwork. But more than anything else, I'm glad that Aquamentus got a second life here in this game. He's not just this game's first boss, he is the first dungeon boss in all of Zelda. And I'm surprised that this game from 2001 was the last time we've seen him. Alas, once he's defeated, we'll find the fertile soil, the first essence of nature. And we're off. So overall, Gnarled Root is pretty average, maybe even below average as a 10th dungeon. But as a first dungeon, I think it's pretty good. It wordlessly teaches the dungeon experience to you, and the concepts that Hero's Cave introduced first get nicely reinforced to the player from its block puzzles, locks and keys, and item gating. It's not likely to stump you, but that's okay. Even with its heavier action focus, the dungeon is incredibly forgiving, with a weirdly generous amount of fairies that can spawn in to heal you. While it isn't necessarily the prettiest dungeon to look at, it gets by just fine, and is just mechanically interesting enough, and laid out smartly enough, to check off pretty well all of my boxes. The enemy variety is good here too. We've got Voles, Scoria, Blade Traps, Stalfos, Keese, and even Wallmasters. Though good enemy variety is something that 2D Zelda rarely struggles with. The game's action focus is immediately noticeable here, and there are even some spots where I was surprised that my hearts started to get close to depletion. All that said, I think we need to address the elephant in the room, or more accurately, the eagle in the room, or perhaps even more accurately, the rooms in the eagle. Okay, so what I'm getting at here is that at some point during development of the Oracle games, a full Game Boy Color remake of Zelda 1 was in the works, but ultimately scrapped. But traces of that remake can be seen here and there, little elements that harken back to the original Zelda, one of those being this dungeon. This is the map of Gnarled Root Dungeon, and this is the map of Zelda 1's first dungeon, the Eagle. Even their dungeon entrances are pretty similar, a hollow tree on a lone island with a bridge extending east. Both of these dungeons feature Aquamentus as the boss, and he's even found in the exact same spot. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot here that allows Gnarled Root to stand out on its own, enough for me to feel it is distinct from the Eagle, which didn't have ember seeds, minecarts, torch puzzles, or even any rooms that weren't of uniform size. But the parts that are similar are eerily so. Though the room sizes got weirdly increased for no discernible reason, and in most cases I don't think that sheer size adds to the gameplay in any meaningful way. None of that necessarily detracts from what is here though, and I think that for what it is, that Gnarled Root Dungeon works pretty well. There's a familiarity to it that is sort of comfy to me, but also enough branching paths to get me to look around carefully and take note of my surroundings. If this came any later in the game, I would be a lot harder on it, but placed right here at the start of seasons, having to either get the action going or at the very least reignite it, I think Gnarled Root does the job pretty elegantly. East of Horon Village, at the far end of the Woods of Winter, sits Link's next destination. However, upon entering the woods, Link follows a certain hooded figure and learns of the existence of Subrosia, a subterranean society where the Temple of Seasons ended up buried. After obtaining the Rod of Seasons and infusing it with the Spirit of Winter, Link is able to cross these frozen ponds and explore the woods in earnest, collecting mystery seeds and obtaining a shovel as he does. The woods themselves are a winding, twisting network of paths filled with moblins, peahats, and even like-likes. A treacherous venture, to be sure, but successfully navigating them will eventually lead us to the second dungeon. Welcome to Snake's Remains, which sounds like a strange name for a dungeon, until you take a glance at the map screen. Just like Link's Awakening did, this game often designs the dungeon layouts to be modeled after specific shapes or objects, with with mixed results. In the case of Snake's Remains, however, they lean into the concept a little more literally than Link's Awakening did. Between the shape of the map and the textures used for the floors and walls, there's a sort of implication that this could be a dungeon quite literally built into the molted skin of a giant serpent, or something to that effect, with torches and doorways having been retrofitted into the discarded remnants of an enormous beast. Aesthetically, I have mixed feelings. This is probably my least favorite dungeon wall texture used in the Game Boy titles, being repurposed from Link's Awakening's Windfish's Egg and Color Dungeon. It's not outright ugly, but I think it's pretty bland. The floor tiles are unique though, and I feel the overall color palette of the dungeon makes for a dank, dark setting, one that overall works decently. The floor especially looks like it could be the scales of that molted snakeskin. Creepy. Though the architecture of this side-scrolling passageway sticks out here. It doesn't really match anything else in this dungeon, making it visually feel a bit out of place. The music here is not my favorite. It has the right kind of spooky feeling to it, so I see what they were going for. I just think it can get pretty repetitive pretty fast is all. It would be pretty low on the list for me if I were to rank all of Season's dungeon themes. In fact, I think there's only one dungeon theme I'd rank lower than this one, and we'll get to that in due time. Overall, it's not an outright sin to music or anything melodramatic like that. It's just not great either, alas. Like Gnarled Root Dungeon, Snake's Remains feels quite well tuned in terms of its difficulty to where it is placed in the game. It also strikes that great balance between having open, explorable space with branching paths, while also locking critical doorways and paths off to make sure you explore thoroughly in order to find keys, and of course, the dungeon item. For a second dungeon, it feels pretty good in terms of complexity. There's more challenge here than Gnarled Root had, but nothing unmanageable. Gnarled Root had the equivalent of 19 standard-sized rooms, or 20 if you counted this one side-scrolling room. Snake's Remains escalates things by having the equivalent of 27 standard-sized rooms, or 29 when counting that side-scrolling passageway. It remains otherwise on a single floor, but there's a reasonable near 50% size increase over the previous dungeon. I also feel like there's a better variety of room layouts and sizes here. Gnarled Root's rooms were fairly uniform in size, with only a few exceptions. That's also the case for the first bunch of rooms here, but as the dungeon goes on, the layouts of the rooms continue to get more varied and interesting. Though, thankfully, even the standard-sized rooms tend to have at least some visual landmarks, even if it's just blocks or torches. The progression in here can be pretty cleanly divided into two acts, the first of which has us exploring this section of the dungeon where we'll need to complete some pretty basic puzzles to unlock doors as we explore and hunt down the map, compass, and dungeon item, though not in that order. I always end up finding the compass first, which feels weird and illegal, but given its placement 2 rooms away from the entrance, that makes sense. Meanwhile, the dungeon item is required to get the map itself, which feels not weird, but maybe still illegal since property damage is involved. The puzzles in this first act mainly come down to either simple push block puzzles where a single block must be pushed into the correct position, usually hinted at by other blocks forming a pattern that must be completed, or shutter doors that will be unlocked upon defeating all of the enemies in the room. Not the most complex stuff, but that's fine. The crisscrossing sort of navigation with well-placed locked doors is the main focus in this section. The dungeon's second act, meanwhile, occupies this northern half of the structure. We'll put the dungeon item to use in several interesting ways, fight the mid-boss, figure out how to get to the boss key, which of course employs the old treasure chest out of reach tease, and then of course take on the boss itself. There's a bit less emphasis on exploration in the second phase, and instead a little more on using the puzzle mechanics to navigate. Okay, that may sound confusing that I'm drawing a distinction between exploration and navigation, but what I mean is that the first section is a bit more cryptic. You're trying to figure out where you even need to go, so you explore to find your bearings. As such, the puzzles in this section aren't all that hard. They're instead just a means to open doors, because the actual puzzle is just figuring out where everything is. Whereas in the second act, you can see where you need to go. You just have to figure out how to actually get there. But since you know your objective, they can add more complications to the way you are able to actually move about within this space. I enjoy both approaches when they're done well, and I think Snake's Remains succeeds in that regard, successfully balancing both, all while staying at a reasonable level of challenge for this point early in the game. The dungeon item is the Power Bracelet, a carryover from Link's Awakening, for better and worse. The downside is that it is still an equipable item for some reason, rather than a strength upgrade that gets auto-equipped, and I just don't get why they made it this way. A lot of people did not like my argument about this when I covered Bottle Grotto, but I'm doubling down here. Okay, at risk of rehashing that Bottle Grotto video, I'm going to try to get through this point in a concise manner. Yes, the constant inventory management is going to be an issue here, and I will try not to dwell on that more than is necessary. These Game Boy games are ambitious titles, especially for the hardware that they're on. Due to the lack of buttons available, item swapping constantly is simply unavoidable. That said, for things like the Power Bracelet, it is a context-sensitive item. You can't just use it anywhere. It is used to interact directly with heavy objects. They could have easily made it so that once you get the item, it is auto-equipped, and you could press A near an item to lift it without having to equip the bracelet every time. For many other items, that simply wouldn't work, but for items like this, it absolutely could, and I know it could because that's how the Link's Awakening remake handled it, that's how A Link to the Past handled it, and that's even how Zelda 1 on the NES handled it. It's not a fix that had to be done in hindsight. Two Zelda games had already done so before putting Zelda on the Game Boy was even an idea. If an NES game could do it this way, why couldn't these games? Why would Link put the bracelet on and take it off between uses? Okay, rant over. I got it out of my system. I have already talked at length about the inventory management system of Link's Awakening, and it is basically identical in the Oracle games, so I won't go on about the subject anymore. Despite that UI stuff, the Power Bracelet is otherwise a good item. It retains the same tactile inputs as the Link's Awakening version of the item, which I honestly like. It makes the act of using the item itself feel good to do. The item gets put to use in some cool ways, allowing you to not only lift heavy objects, but also push these heavy cylinders. Right away, we can learn to use it in order to get this treasure chest containing the map, and it's likely that players may have encountered one of these cylinders already by this point, and be eager to rush back to try out their new item. There are two pathways that these rolling cylinders block. The path to the south will take us to a necessary key, while the path just northeast of there will bring us to the dungeon's second half. I like these. They present a more memorable item gate than just a lot of heavy pottery, though of course the Power Bracelet isn't solely used for progression, since now there's a new way to get loot and replenish our resources thanks to that abundance of smashable pots. Snake's Remains also marks this game's first instance of side-scrolling passageways connecting to distant areas. I don't love the concept much, as I've already discussed in my coverage of Link's Awakening, though I don't hate it as much as people think I do. I do maintain my position that it feels like something of a band-aid solution to accommodating the layout's shape, but there's only one here, and the two sections of the dungeon that it bridges are entirely disconnected otherwise, so overall it's not that intrusive here. Unless you missed just a small key, there's no real reason to backtrack to section 1 after you've crossed through here. So in this case, it doesn't end up feeling like something that muddles the navigation. Though in addition to this passageway, there's a little section where you pop out of the dungeon briefly and pop back in. Typically, I find things like this neat, like it helps the dungeon feel like an actual part of the overworld. But in this case, it is functionally very similar to the side-scrolling passageways. Dipping out here is the only way to reach these westernmost rooms, which contains a vital small key. It's not like it's a little dip out for a secret. This is critical to progression in exactly the same way that many side-scrolling halls have been. And now that I'm reflecting on this is the same thing that Turtle Rock and Turtle Rock have also done. Maybe I'm a hypocrite. I think what works better about this concept is that you tend to move in the same direction as where you're going instead of a complete perspective shift, which makes it feel more natural, I guess. I'm not sure. I think I need to dwell on this further. Oh well. The mid-boss here is Facade, marking his only reappearance after Link's Awakening, aside from later in this game where he's shamelessly recycled. Honestly, I don't really like that he appears here all that much. Not that the fight itself is bad per se, but it feels far less fitting than his appearance in Face Shrine. Facade is literally the floor of the room, coming alive and trying to swallow you by growing a face. It's a very surreal boss concept, one that worked really well for Link's Awakening, a game that, spoilers, is set in a dream world. Surrealism works in that game's favor because of the themes and its overall narrative. It's the point in the game where denial is no longer possible for Link. Including Facade here in Seasons feels like it kind of undermines his importance as a boss in the story of Link's Awakening, because apparently Facade can exist in the real world now. It makes the surrealist concept of confronting Link with a cold truth just less impactful, especially if you subscribe to the Historia timeline placement that sets the Oracle games as an in-between-quel after A Link to the Past and before Link's Awakening. So not only is Facade's appearance in Face Shrine a plausible boss encounter now, but it's also something Link has seen before. Twice? I really feel like they should have just left Facade out of the game entirely, and let him stay unique to Link's Awakening. But alas, the fight itself is pretty simple though. Avoid his attacks, and explode his face with bombs until he dies. That's it. I will admit that even though I dislike this from a narrative standpoint, from a gameplay standpoint, I do think it works better as a mid-boss than as a proper dungeon boss, due in no small part to that simplicity, and the actual moment in which you encounter him is pretty neat. There's a bit of eeriness walking into this large chamber, seeing it empty, but just knowing based on the room's design that something is going to jump out at you, only for him to appear on the floor below you like that. It's a great moment that sort of plays on your intuition, without outright being a jump scare. Despite the fact that the power bracelet is the main dungeon item, bombs also get a surprising amount of use here, including an entire room built around exploding cracked blocks, using it for the mid-boss, as already mentioned, and even later for the boss itself, as well as a couple of other combat encounters. Of course, bombs are required for one destructible wall in Gnarled route as well, so we should have them by this point, but I'm a little surprised by how much it feels like the dungeon is designed with them in mind. I can't think of another way to take on these moblins or these Pols Voice aside from hurling bombs at them. At least that's how I've always done it. There are plenty of spots to replenish your stock, so the dungeon definitely doesn't want you to be shy about using them. Something else this dungeon introduces is this unidirectional mechanism, which I'll be referring to as a turnstile because I don't know what else to call it. I absolutely adore this as a puzzle navigation mechanic. When stepping into the turnstile, you'll be forcefully led through and ejected 90 degrees of the way you entered, with an included visual indicator of the direction it'll take you. So despite this room presenting a fork in the road with 3 paths ahead of you, only one of these paths will be accessible based on the way the turnstile is oriented. The direction it rotates will be flipped every time you use it as well, meaning meaning that if you go through it, you'll only be able to go back the way you came, clockwise or counterclockwise. So as a puzzle navigation mechanic, it becomes about making sure you explore all your options, know which way this will rotate, and making sure that you enter the room from the correct direction so that you end up where you want to go. As complex as this sounds, it is really intuitive in practice. There's only a single one of these turnstiles here in this dungeon, and I think that once you have a handle on how it works, that it's pretty easy to figure out how to manipulate the unidirectional function of it in your favor. But more than anything, its inclusion here is good setup for later dungeons to build off this idea and run with it, both in this game and especially in Oracle of Ages. It adds a really neat puzzle element to the navigation of Act 2, requiring you to be mindful of the direction that it is set and approach the room accordingly. Good stuff. So once we've gotten past that turnstile and over these moving platforms, we'll be able to finally confront the dungeon boss. Oh, he was just chilling in here, wasn't he? Sorry to interrupt. Alright, this is Dodongo. Yeah, not King Dodongo, just a Dodongo, I guess. It's more of a spectacle kind of fight than a proper challenge, but it's a lot of fun. Dodongo here looks great, leaning into that Triceratops design from the original Legend of Zelda. And like Aquamentus, he's clearly gone through something of a glow-up here, with a much larger and more detailed sprite. He looks great, and is super expressive. I mean, just look at his goofy face. It's an achievement that they were able to make him look this good while using literally only 3 colors. This battle against Dodongo is a nice mesh of a couple of different boss concepts. There is a bit of the usual stun then deal damage kind of combat flow here, but with a nice twist. Instead of going ham on him with your sword while he's vulnerable, you need to pick him up and huck him into the bed of spikes in the center of the arena. Of course, in order to stun him, you must first feed him bombs when the opening presents itself. His body language also really nicely telegraphs both when he is about to attack, as well as when he is vulnerable. Overall, it feels like a nice cross between the usual classic Dodongo fights and Jalhalla from Wind Waker. You know, if he was a dinosaur rather than a ghost guy. The fight makes good use of both bombs, which have had frequent use cases within the dungeon, as well as the power bracelet, which is of course the dungeon item itself. It's probably the best way they could even incorporate an item like this into the battle. Of course, this isn't really a challenging battle, but it is a very fun one. Dodongo really benefits from the visual overhaul here, and he's just a pleasure to take on. I just can't get over his facial expressions here. What a great design. Aside from that, I don't really have too much to say about this encounter. It should only take a few throws into the spikes, and Dodongo will go down. Once he's defeated, we'll find the gift of time, the second essence of nature. And once again, we're off. So overall, I think Snake's Remains is a pretty good second dungeon, which has a lot to offer in terms of exploration and action. Due to the disjointed 2 halves of the dungeon, there's not really any sort of discernible central room for the navigation to be anchored from, but that's okay. There's a lot of branching paths and forks in the road, which will typically have an inaccessible path or 2, and keys hidden around to find. I enjoy how much room they give you to just explore and find your way around. Even though a lot of shutter doors will seemingly block your path, this early section will typically give you the means to open them up within that very room so that you can continue exploring, meaning that despite there being 2 keys to find in that early section, you could potentially explore up to 10 rooms in here before spending a single key. I like that. There's a certain level of faith in the player to be able to stumble around and figure figure things out for themselves. Plus, the turnstile mechanic is such a treat, and I'm glad to see it show up this early into seasons, even if it doesn't get as much time to shine in this game compared to the Dungeons of Ages. Still, it's a mechanic I love, though it is kind of a shame that already by Dungeon 2, the tedium of inventory management is starting to rear its head, which is indicative of both a strength and weakness of this game. It uses your entire inventory really well and quite consistently. Very few items will be sidelined between these two games, which is good, but the hardware, namely the lack of buttons on the Game Boy Color, holds it back, requiring constant menuing, so it's good level design clashing with poor UI design. That said, I think I've talked about this subject to death at this point, so you won't hear me go on about it again during the run of these two games. The enemy variety is not bad here. Lots of blade traps, including giant ones, thwomps, including the baby ones, Pole's voice, and a lot of the other usual suspects. But mostly, it is snakes and more snakes.
Actually, those are called ropes.
Yeah, I know, and sure, ropes, okay, but they're snakes. The dungeon is called Snake's Remains. They were clearly going for something here. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this, but just as Gnarled Root had similarities to the Eagle dungeon, Snake's Remains bears some similarities to the Moon dungeon, level 2 in the original Legend of Zelda, mostly in the dungeon shape and boss. There are far fewer room-to-room similarities here, although the Moon does have a lot of bombable walls, though I'd say on an individual room basis that this dungeon probably pulls more ideas from Link's Awakening than Zelda 1. This room where we find the power bracelet feels like it was pulled right out of Key Cavern, and the overall structure feels a lot like Tail Cave just as much as it does the Moon, albeit much larger than either of them. But yeah, you may already be observing a trend here. Unlike Aquamentus, the Dongos have made several appearances throughout the series, especially in second dungeons for some reason, but I would hazard a guess that this particular take on the boss seems to be a carryover from the stage of development in which they wanted to remake Zelda 1, and that this was going to be a heavily reworked Moon dungeon. And if that is the case, I think this makes for a really interesting new take on that. Besides, like Aquamentus did, I think Dodongo benefits greatly from the overhaul here. So yeah, Snake's Remains is more interesting than I initially would have thought, and I think it's a fairly competent second dungeon. The best this game has to offer is still to come, of course, but this one carries on from Gnarled Root successfully, balancing elements like puzzle solving, exploration, and combat really well. It has a lot to offer without feeling overwhelming in any way. Overall, I quite like it. Deep in the trenches of Spool Swamp, behind a water dam, hides the third essence of nature. However, in order to get to it, Link will need to make friends with some animal companions, go on a date with a Subrosian, and eventually make his way back to the buried Temple of Seasons in order to harness the power of summer. In summer, creeks dry up and vines grow tall, which will allow us to climb our way into the next dungeon. Welcome to Poison Moth's Lair, a conceptually very interesting dungeon. But first, I have to get something of a bold claim out of the way. Remember when I said that there was only one piece of dungeon music that I'd rank as worse than Snake's Remains? That would be this track. This is genuinely my least favorite piece of dungeon music, period. Not just in this game, but in the entire dang series. I see what they're going for with the two alternating curious and danger sections of the song, but something about it is genuinely so grating. I can only describe it as repetitive, plodding bloop sounds. I dislike it so much that I decided to put it at the top of the script here just to get it out of the way and not subject my future editing self to this track longer than is necessary.
Thanks.
There's some genuinely great stuff in this game's soundtrack, but this is not it. The good news is that we can only go up from here, and up we will go, I can assure you. Visually speaking, the dungeon gets by okay. I think the color palette works pretty well. I like the blue stone walls, and I don't think the beige floor clashes here in any negative way. It's fairly neutral, though it is pretty visually similar to Bottle Grotto from Link's Awakening DX, right down to recycling the flagstone floor texture, but all a bit brighter here than that dungeon. At first, I thought this was the old wafer cookie walls making a return, but it is actually a slightly different wall texture, one that I don't think was borrowed from Link's Awakening at all, as far as I can tell at least. Still, the dungeon does add little bits of visual flair, paired with interesting and diverse room layouts, in order to keep important things memorable and engaging for the player, and it does so to great effect, whether it be by highlighting important spots with these purple floor tiles, or going all out decorating this hallway with tons of torches to convey its significance, since that's where the boss door is, or just by using interesting room layouts filled with obstacles that will stick out in the player's heads. There's no sameness in this dungeon's floor plan. Every room is unique. This is also Season's first dungeon to have a second floor, which helps to make things feel larger and more sprawling than they actually are. The dungeon is made up of the equivalent of 28 or 32 standard-sized rooms. That's 15 on the first floor, 13 on the second floor, and 4 to make up the side-scrolling passageways. Not a massive increase over the last dungeon, but I don't think that bigger for the sake of bigger would have been the best choice. It's more important that the dungeon does interesting things. The overall layout appears vaguely moth-shaped on the first floor, but not at all on the second, forming almost a rectangle. And I'm glad they didn't try to constrain themselves too much to the dungeon shape here. But there are a few moments where things start feeling a little bit disjointed with the layout, particularly when you need to reach the northernmost rooms on either floor. These are disconnected entirely on the map, and only reachable through those aforementioned side-scrolling sections. But they do keep that navigational aspect fairly linear when those come into play, so I feel it's handled as well as one could ask for in these cases at least. If I had to nail down a singular guiding design principle for this dungeon, I would say that more than anything, Poison Moth's Lair is a big test of your spatial awareness, or at the very least a lesson to the player that spatial awareness is something they need to be keenly aware of when dungeon crawling going forward. It does so by employing what I've often referred to as the treasure chest tease. I don't know if there's actually an official name for this concept, but I named it so for the way Zelda games, especially the top-down titles, will often allow you to see a treasure chest before you're able to actually reach it, teasing you. This idea can be used to motivate you to explore, give you a navigational objective to chase after, or even serve as a landmark. And most effectively perhaps, it makes the payoff of opening the chest and getting what is inside of it feel more satisfying than it would be if you just stumbled blindly upon it. It's that anticipation. It builds excitement to see treasure just out of reach. This dungeon uses this concept incredibly well, and it uses it for more than just treasure chests. There is still some of that, of course, but in addition to treasure chests, sometimes you'll see platforms, new paths to explore, obstacles, or even these trampolines, all designed to get you to constantly keep the entirety of the dungeon layout in mind, as well as piquing your curiosity. Right off of the first room, we can spot the chest with the boss key up on this ledge. In the next room, we can see an entire area we can't reach due to this chasm. In the next room, another out of reach area which actually leads to the end of the dungeon no less. In this hallway, there's a double double tease another treasure chest on a ledge, albeit an optional one, as well as this staircase beyond this chasm. They tease us with this hallway a bit farther down, which we can't cross yet due to the collapsing floor. They tease us by showing us all these ledges and walkways that we can't reach yet, and making us walk past the boss door in this all-important looking hallway. You get the idea. Constantly, the level designers are showing us things to come, giving us little things that we need to file away and revisit later. And I love that sort of thing. It imparts upon the player a greater sense of the dungeon being one larger, interconnected structure that we have to crisscross through, even if in reality these two areas may be entirely separated from a gameplay standpoint. Another very important way that this dungeon leans into that spatial awareness idea is in the way it uses its verticality. The second floor isn't here for no reason. Going back and forth between the two floors is vital for progression. Often we are required to either drop down from the floor above to a specific spot below, or do the inverse of that by using these trampolines to bounce up to the floor above. This is a really fun way to navigate. You'll see the spot that you need to reach, such as this ledge with the staircase in this water room, or this blocked off section of this second floor room, and either jump down the appropriate pit or move the trampoline into position in order to jump back up to the right spot. Verticality in 3D Zelda is surprisingly easier and more natural to incorporate, but the 2D games have really only played with this idea a handful of times before this. The Tower of Hera in A Link to the Past, and Link's Awakening's Eagle's Tower being prime examples of this. And while I thought these were well-designed dungeons, even in these cases we were only able to use that verticality in a navigational sense in one direction, jumping down to the floor below, not back up. This is something I admire a great deal about the Oracle titles, however. The way they iterate on these tried and true Zelda concepts and take them to their logical extremes. Why not have a way to launch ourselves back up? And why not build puzzles around doing so? And so they did. And it works great. So in short, Poison Moth's Lair tests the player's spatial awareness by asking them to keep track of how these two floors and your position within them relate to each other, and how you can use that information to navigate this space successfully. And it is brilliantly done. Also, trampolines are just fun, plain and simple. Of course, before you can use one of these trampolines, you'll need to track down the dungeon item, the Rock's Feather. It's located in this northwestern room on the second floor. You may recall, if you've seen my Link's Awakening coverage, that I adore this item. It's always fun to gain new abilities related to mobility. In short, it lets you jump, which in turn will allow us to cross over gaps in the floor, jump onto those trampolines, and even avoid some obstacles and traps, like these giant blade traps or spikes in the floor. The most clever use for it, perhaps, is to jump over the switch on the floor of this hallway, which is such a clever little item gate. Usually in these games you want to press the button, not avoid it. This also takes us to the dungeon's mid-boss. These guys are called Omwai. Omwai, though apparently some sources refer to them as Calamar Eye, which is a pretty fun name, but Zelda Encyclopedia calls them Omwai, so that's what I'm going with, even if I am sort of winging it with the pronunciation here. These guys are kind of a neat mid-boss, but I do think that there is something of a cryptic element to fighting them. What you're supposed to do is use the power bracelet to yank them out of their little pools, then toss them to the ground and go wild with your sword. That said, they're not the most intuitively designed enemies. I don't exactly recall my first time fighting them and how I figured this out, but I did go back and check the VOD from when I streamed this game back in the summer of 2024, and even then I basically had to work my way through Link's entire inventory trying items out on them. Once you know how to fight them, they shouldn't present too much of a challenge, but figuring out what to actually do is kind of the hard part. There is an owl statue with a hint for this, which says, items. In water, it is invincible, which is probably enough of a clue to land on this method that you need to remove them from their pools of water. My only issue with this is that the statue is placed on this ledge, which would be pretty easy to miss before actually heading into that mid-boss chamber. I should stress, I don't think that this is a huge deal, but I did think it was still worth pointing out. With all of that said, once we've combed through both floors and found the correct spot to drop down to in order to grab the boss key, we can cross over this section of the upper floor and confront the dungeon boss. Waiting to ambush us is this game's version of Mothula. So unlike the last two bosses, Mothula is not a boss reworked from Zelda 1, having originated instead from A Link to the Past, appearing as the boss of Skull Woods. They look pretty good here too. I wouldn't necessarily call it an improvement over the SNES version, but it could only translate over so well to a Game Boy Color sprite. Still, Mothula's design does have some tweaks, like having only a singular but much larger eyeball, and having a slightly less busy look overall. It actually feels like a really logical progression of the design evolution when considering that this game came out after A Link to the Past, but before Wind Waker. Speaking of design evolutions, you may recall from A Link to the Past that Mothula itself wasn't actually too challenging, especially for how well Link was equipped by that point in the game. The challenge instead was found in the frankly chaotic arena, which was extremely hazardous, surrounding Link with blade traps set atop a shifting floor. I'm not sure if it's due to technical limitations, maybe the Game Boy Color wouldn't have been able to handle so many moving parts, or if it was for another reason. Maybe they wanted to align it with this dungeon's design philosophy more, but regardless, Mothula has been heavily reworked here, and if you ask me, this change was for the better. Rather than relying on the obstacles of the arena, Mothula actually behaves aggressively here. It fights by launching projectiles either directly at you or in a circular wave around itself, deploying a handful of minions and zooming around the arena at high speeds. Not to say that the boss of Skull Woods was passive per se, but Mothula itself feels far more involved in the fight this time around. Of course, the arena does still play a part in the challenge. There's a figure-8 shaped pit in the center of the room, which Link can be knocked down and into the room below, keeping in theme with the rest of the dungeon. Reminiscent of previous Moldorm appearances, the fight will need to be restarted if you are pushed out of the ring, though at least it's a lot snappier to get back upstairs thanks to the trampoline down here, allowing you to get back into the fight much quicker. I have no doubt that a lot of people find this to be a frustrating element to the battle, but I actually really like this mechanic, as annoying as it may seem. Other bosses penalize you with damage, and that's fine, but battling Mothula here is just as much about taking them down as it is staying in the fight yourself, and that adds some much needed stakes to the battle. Mothula doesn't exactly have a huge health pool, and can be defeated really quickly otherwise, so the added tension here goes a long way to making the fight more memorable. So overall, not too hard of a boss fight, so long as your reflexes are quick and you're feeling tenacious. Just keep on it, and Mothula will go down. Once they're defeated, we can head down these stairs to another section of the room below, where we'll find the bright sun, the third essence of nature. So overall, despite containing some pretty awful music, I think Poison Moth's Lair is a really well-designed dungeon, and it's the first dungeon in the game to really give me pause and get me to really check my map. Plus, after the way the last two dungeons felt like reworked Zelda 1 dungeons, albeit with pretty significant overhauls, this one feels so fresh and original in a way that is only to its benefit. A lot of the navigation is reasonably streamlined, especially especially during the first half of the dungeon, but you can feel the well-tuned difficulty curve escalating the challenge here nicely, as you need to keep the overall layout in mind, and how your position allows access to other parts of the dungeon, namely moving between the two floors. The dungeon starts with you exploring nearly the entire structure, going through most of the first floor, upstairs, and then all the way to the opposite end of the second floor, in order to tease you with everything and allow you to gain the lay of the land before rewarding you with the dungeon item, which pretty much just unlocks the rest of the dungeon, setting you loose, letting you gather everything you couldn't before. The item gates here are well thought out, with gaps to jump over, moving platforms, and even these little overhead walkways that you need to leap across above other explorable spaces. All of this keeps the design within that theme of spatial awareness, and is explored both on an individual room basis as well as within the larger structure as a whole. I appreciate that the game held off on implementing multiple floors in the dungeon layouts until a point where incorporating another floor would actually be a benefit to the design. It's thoughtful and purposeful in a way that I can't help but appreciate. Continuing from Snake's Remains, we also have some really good item integration. There's use cases for bombs, the power bracelet, the Rock's Feather of course, and even your shield, which is often neglected in these Game Boy titles. It's always a little disappointing to me when a Zelda game gives you a really cool item and then forgets to do anything with it after the dungeon it's found in, but they took the time to keep these previous items relevant and useful, and the Rock's Feather especially is going to be vital going forward, until it gets replaced, that is. Also, I wasn't sure where to include this in the script, but this statue pushing puzzle is neat. You're only matching the pattern of these statues with those on the other side of the room, but even this little puzzle requires a degree of spatial awareness, since you need to have room to actually push the statues, and they must be pushed, not pulled. It's a relatively simple puzzle, but a neat one. Like, I actually have to think about it for a second, instead of just immediately shoving something into place. It's a lot more interesting than any of the previous two dungeons' little push block puzzles. So yeah, overall, I think Poison Moth's Lair would be an easy dungeon to overlook. There's no plot significance to be had here, aside from the usual dungeon MacGuffin. There's not a ton to visually set it apart, and the music is pretty bad. But beneath all that superficial stuff is an expertly crafted dungeon that makes you have to consider how you move about within the space it gives you. It's not a perfect dungeon. I do wish they had found a better way to bridge these northern rooms and the rest of the dungeon personally. It feels like a bit of a disjointed little detour when you get into it, isolated from the rest of the structure. But maybe that only feels as jarring to me as it does because of how perfectly interconnected and cohesive the rest of the dungeon feels as one larger structure, rather than just a bunch of rooms slapped together haphazardly. So it may not be without a few blemishes, but those don't come anywhere close to overshadowing just how good everything else here is. Hidden behind a waterfall near the peak of Mount Kuko hides the next essence of nature. However, there's quite a bit more for Link to do before he can get there, including getting the flippers from the master diver just north of Sunken City and a return trip to Subrosia. A couple of little rascals down here will steal Link's recently acquired Rock's Feather, but after recovering it, we can return to the Temple of Seasons and obtain the power of spring. This change in season opens up new paths in Holodrum, as these stone buds will bloom into flowers. Now we can help Moosh get some bananas so that he'll help us get the Dragon Key, which of course will unlock the next dungeon. Welcome to Dancing Dragon Dungeon. And let me just say, this is a good one. For whatever reason, out of all of the dungeons between these two games, this one always stands out in my memory as one I always look forward to playing through. I just find myself having a great time in here. Dungeon is fun. Fungin. In terms of aesthetics, it's just okay. The overall color palette of gray and this yellowy green is not my favorite combination, but it sure could be worse. It isn't exactly the same, but the floor and wall textures do bear a passing resemblance to those of Turtle Rock in Link's Awakening, albeit with some tweaks and overall more uniformity, and a different color palette of course. Regardless, the architecture is not exactly where this dungeon shines. I would hesitate to call it outright ugly, but beyond that, there's not much more to say. The music, on the other hand, is absolutely a great time. It's actually a bit funny that they follow up the dungeon which had the worst music immediately with the dungeon that has the best music in the game. There's something about it. The melody, that bass line, it's so danceable. Such a banger. I can't help but wonder about how this ties into the dungeon's naming convention. There's no dragon in this Dancing Dragon dungeon, and the dungeon layout and shape don't seem to fit into this either, as near as I can tell. So I wonder, was the dungeon named this because of the superbly danceable music, or did the composer decide to make the dungeon theme a total bop because they saw they'd be writing music for a place called Dancing Dragon Dungeon? Chicken or the egg scenario, who knows? Regardless, it's a great piece, and this is Game Boy music. Talk about making do with what you've got. The previous dungeon themes have sort of stuck to this formula of alternating between curious and danger sections. This one seems to deviate from that, adding a sort of confident swagger to the dungeon music. And I think that fits. We're basically at the halfway point of the game, and settling into something of a gameplay rhythm. And I think reflecting Link's comfortability and confidence in dungeon crawling within the music before we get to some of the game's tougher dungeons makes a lot of sense. At least that's how I interpret it. Hey, it's future editing me here. So it's been pointed out to me that the dungeon layout actually is kinda dragon-like. If you were to combine all three floors, you get the dragon shape. So floor 2 would be the head, floor 1 would be the body with its wings spread, and then basement 1 would be the tail. So if you kind of just stack them, you get the dragon shape. I don't know why I didn't notice that. I see it now, but I feel a little silly for missing that. So a shout out to Natalie Inkwell for pointing that out to me in the comments of the original upload. Appreciate it, and I'll get out of the way for my past recording to get back into it. This has been future editing me, signing off. Dancing Dragon Dungeon further ups the ante here by having 3 floors, although basement 1 is pretty small, containing only a handful of rooms leading up to and including the boss fight and essence room, 5 to be exact. The bulk of the dungeon, meanwhile, takes place on the top 2 floors, with the equivalent of 18 standard-sized rooms on the first floor, 15 on the second, and an additional 2 that make up this side-scrolling hallway, all in all totaling 40 standard rooms, which is pretty sizable. It's cool to see dungeons this big this early in the game. I mean, this place is almost as big as Turtle Rock, the final dungeon in Link's Awakening, which, for comparison, had 46 standard rooms. Of course, there are some instances of larger rooms taking up 2 map tiles, but the majority of them keep to that standard room size. So when it comes to room orientations and layouts, there's a bit less variety here compared to the last 2 dungeons, but I'd argue that there's enough fun stuff going on in here to make up for that. The rooms may mostly be uniform rectangular chambers, but the puzzles and obstacles found within are varied and interesting. I do think it's a bit odd that the dungeon entrance is on floor 2 though. Not that the entrance being on the top floor is out of the ordinary, but usually the ground level is floor 1, and if we're going down from there, it would be into the basement. That said, the entrance when viewed from the exterior is on a mountainside, not ground level, so it actually does make sense. The overall navigation centers mostly around following the dungeon's various branching paths. Even from the very onset of the dungeon, you'll be seeing forks in the road, with one of them ultimately being a dead end until the necessary keys are found, which will be hidden down the other paths. And I mean that in both the literal key sense as well as the item gate sense. So there is a sort of constant process of elimination to the progression here. As you see which paths are viable, follow them to their conclusions, and then check the other paths. Considering how infrequently the Oracle games tend to implement any sort of core central room, having this split path and backtrack structure works surprisingly well. It feels like the dungeon is appropriately tackled in manageable chunks, which you will need to crisscross a bit before moving on to the next chunk, with very little reason typically to backtrack to a previous section unless you missed something crucial on your first visit, like one of those aforementioned small keys. The core dungeon gimmick employed in that exploration is the use of these minecarts, requiring the player to flip various levers, which switch the minecart tracks, allowing us to reach new areas. It's a fun enough mechanic that adds memorable set pieces to the way we just move about in here. Exploring is fun enough on its own, but there's something exciting about hopping in the cart and just seeing where it takes you. I think if every dungeon was like this, that I would get tired of it, but it is used sparingly enough in these games and just adds a little bit of extra flavor, breaking up the monotony of just walking from room to room and making every trip in the cart feel like something of a commitment. Moreover, it builds on the concept really nicely, iterating on the idea. It begins with us flipping a lever with our sword just while we're passing by, then later needing to use the dungeon item to flip a switch out of reach, and eventually needing to flip multiple distance switches in a row. Speaking of which, the dungeon item here is the slingshot, which works exactly as you'd expect, though I think this is probably the most interesting version of a slingshot in the entire series, since instead of having its own dedicated but ultimately standard ammunition like in other games, you use the various seeds from your seed satchels instead, which can have different effects. The ember seeds we found back in Gnarled being the important ones here. So in essence, we get a fire-based projectile attack with this item, which is pretty cool, though you could also look at this as being sort of an upgrade to the seed satchel, allowing you to fling seeds at a distance rather than having to be right up against whatever you're using them on. This will be put to use in combat, of course, but more importantly, for puzzle mechanics, as the dungeon starts putting torches that need lighting out of reach. And of course, combining this concept with the previously mentioned minecarts, with switches and torches needing to be shot in succession as a sort of reflexive, reaction time based puzzle. This is good stuff right here. Of course, like the prior dungeons, the slingshot isn't the only useful tool in Link's arsenal here. There's a ton of use cases for previously acquired items, such as the ember seeds being put to use before we even get the slingshot, bombs to break open destructible walls, and the Rock's Feather to jump over gaps. It even gets combined with the Pegasus seeds to enable longer running jumps, much in the same way as we could do with the Pegasus boots in Link's Awakening. The flippers in particular, which we found during the dungeon lead-up, get to really shine through here. We need to use them to cross huge flooded sections of the room, dive to avoid spike traps, and even retrieve both a small key and later the boss key from underwater. Before finding the dungeon item, in the near center of floor 1, we'll encounter the mid-boss. This guy is called Agunima, Fighting him is pretty interesting. Agonima will summon illusory copies of himself, and you'll need to spot the visual tell to figure out which one is the real one, though that visual tell is what sets this fight apart from other illusory copy fights that we've seen throughout the series. The room will continually darken, with us needing to keep these torches lit. This is important because only the real Agonima will cast a shadow, so make sure you're stocked up on those ember seeds. There is a Deku Scrub a couple of rooms back who will sell them, though you can reliably get them as item drops from the bushes in the room here, so I would save the rupees personally. All in all though, this is a pretty decent fight. Like the Omwai, if I'm even pronouncing this right, I think the real challenge here is figuring out how to even deal damage, as once you know what to do, it ends up being pretty easy. But that cryptic element is the main roadblock here. That said, I think it is a fair amount more intuitive than the Omwai fight.
Oh, I think I see it. He's got a shadow, which is why you need to light the torches. Okay, that's pretty clever.
I do need to address Agonima's name and appearance as well though, which seems like a pretty deliberate reference to Aghanim from A Link to the Past. Apparently, some old strategy guides even did refer to this character as Aghanim. Of course, the similarities are undeniable, but I don't think that this is canonically the same character. In fact, here's what Zelda Wiki says about the name. Agonima's name is identical to Aghanim's Japanese name, Agonimu, except for the final kana, ma, instead of mu. Rather than a spelling mistake, this appears to be intentional to distinguish him from the real Aghanim. So there you have it, a reference to A Link to the Past, but not the same wizard canonically. So with all that done, once we've retrieved the boss key and found our way down to the bottom floor, we can use the slingshot to extend this bridge and confront the dungeon boss. Dropping from the ceiling is this game's version of Goma. Here we go again, here we go, again. We all know her, we all love her, it's Goma, big eyeball and all. Though I do think it's interesting to compare how different games interpret the iconic boss. This one clearly iterated on the Link's Awakening version, visually using that sprite as a foundation to build off of, changing the color palette and perhaps most notably adding those big ol' crab claws. Though the way she drops off the ceiling feels like a direct callback to the Goma fight in Ocarina of Time, but done as well as they could on the Game Boy. Seeing its shadow creeping towards you is a great little detail especially. Goma's designs historically have fallen somewhere along a spectrum with Spider on one end and Crab on the other, Wind Waker being an outlier here. Twilight Princess and Echoes of Wisdom have the most spider-like designs, whereas I'd say this take on Goma has gotta be the most crabby version to date. It works though, and it helps this one stand out among the gallery of Gomas. As for actually fighting Goma, this one is a pretty fun battle, and that crab claw isn't just for fashion either, it's actually functional. Goma will attempt to grab you, and if successful, will slam you against the ground and toss you across the room. This sort of attack is really cool to see, honestly. Something about a boss being able to just overpower you like this makes them feel like so much more of a threat, and it's kind of surprising that they could get something as cool as this to work on the Game Boy. She'll also spawn little Goma babies, which can be disposed of to replenish your stock of items. Of course, in order to deal with Goma herself, you'll need to first disarm her. That is to say, we gotta break her claw right off like some sort of peckish aristocrab. Once we've broken through that defense and removed the hazard of being manhandled, we can target Goma's vulnerable eyeball with the slingshot to deal damage, and eventually bring her down. I should mention as well that, just in case that big eyeball weak point isn't obvious enough, the owl statue right before the boss room does give a pretty well-worded hint towards this. this. Otherwise, I don't have too much more to say about this fight. Goma is a pretty consistently fun boss battle, and I appreciate the added crabby twist this particular version of the boss brings to the table, but it is otherwise still very much Goma. So with enough hits to the eye, Goma will go down. Once she's defeated, we'll be able to find the Soothing Rain, the fourth essence of nature. So, overall, Dancing Dragon offers us a fun dungeon above all else, one that is broken into several manageable chunks that can each be tackled in relatively quick succession, which makes progress through here feel winding and twisting, while simultaneously like you're constantly progressing forward. In some ways, it's a lot like the 3-act structure that many other dungeons use, but if it were like 5 or 6 smaller to medium-sized acts instead of 3 big ones. While the dungeon doesn't really have any big picture overarching puzzles, each of these smaller segments are filled with a bunch of fun little micro challenges. And of course, the music is so fun in fact, that I had to commission Wolflink's Shadow to make me a cover of this song to use in this video. That's what you're hearing in the background right now, and I love it, man, thanks so much. By the way, he also did the Tarm Ruins cover that you heard at the beginning of the video. Links to his channel are down below in the description, of course. So, in an earlier version of this script, I speculated that Dancing Dragon Dungeon may have been a heavily reworked Manji, the third dungeon from the original Legend of Zelda. I can see where my head was at when I wrote that, particularly when looking at floor 1. I was thinking maybe they were trying to make it look less Manji-like, so as to avoid some controversy. However, the more I look at it and compare the maps, the less likely I feel this is the case. Gnarled Root's connection to the eagle was solid, but Dancing Dragon's resemblance to the Manji may be a bit of a stretch, especially considering the lack of an eastern spoke, and the orientation of the symbol being mirrored. It's just too different, and while yes, Goma is also in Zelda 1 as a dungeon boss, it's for an entirely different dungeon. In fact, I'd say that the first floor's layout in Dancing Dragon bears just as much of a resemblance to the eagle as it does the Manji. So I changed my mind on this. If there is a link there, it's too weak for me. And if they did start with that as a foundation, whatever overhauls they did make are significant enough to fool me. Those loose potential connections aside, the dungeon that we did get is a bit of an odd one. On paper, I almost feel like I shouldn't like it as much as I do. No central chamber, no big interconnected puzzles, or novel mechanics that aren't present in other dungeons, yet I always find myself beaming while playing through here. There's this intangible element of fun here that's hard to pinpoint, but I know it when I feel it. The dungeon is a bit labyrinthian, with lots of forks in the road, tons of hidden goodies to collect, not just the map and compass, but keys stashed behind easy to intuit puzzles, which open the various locked doors along what is ultimately the critical path. And the way the mechanics that are here get iterated upon is great. We were introduced to how minecarts work back in Gnarled Root, but now the paths split off more frequently. The levers have an added element of distance and timing that we hadn't encountered before. We all know the mechanic of torches that need lighting too. Nothing super groundbreaking there, and you use that mechanic to light up a dark room. Makes sense. But then it gets incorporated into the mid-boss fight, and then into that same minecart mechanic. It's the way these puzzles build on themselves. It's so expertly crafted. A few more stray thoughts I have. There's this one puzzle where we need to push a handful of pots to stay on multiple floor switches. This is something of a follow-up to a puzzle back in Poison Moth's Lair, but instead of just one button, now there's a whole bunch of them. And in order to get yourself into position to push them, you need to break just a couple to get in there, but not too many or you won't have enough pots for all all the switches. I think this is neat. It's simple enough, but it's an exercise in planning, positioning, and most importantly, restraint. Seriously, whenever I see a bunch of pots in a room, my instinct is to just start smashing them for item drops. I will say that I have learned this lesson the hard way and had to go reset the puzzle. Whoops. I also mentioned before this room in which you need to light these torches. The floor is already dark, and you need to move along these narrow walkways to get the treasure chest in here. The floor isn't invisible, but it's a dark floor over a dark chasm. Unfortunately, this puzzle ends up feeling a bit superfluous on modern screens, because, well, I can see the floor just fine. I imagine this was a lot more dangerous on the original, non-backlit Game Boy Color screen, so this is kind of a weird case where the inferior hardware is actually to the benefit of the puzzle design. There's also the boss key puzzle. You have to fight a bunch of enemies in this room with this skull-shaped island, and then dive down the right or left eye to retrieve the boss key from underwater. This itself is a sequel to an earlier puzzle where we saw a small key drop into the water, but we didn't get that preview this time. It's a bit funny though, because it's almost too intuitive in a way. I personally never struggled to find that key. I think on just about every playthrough of this game, I've always ended up finding the hint for the puzzle after I already got the boss key. Thanks anyway, old man. So overall, Dancing Dragon is a solid dungeon, one that I always look forward to revisiting, and what it may lack in novelty, it makes up for in polish. Minecarts and switches aren't exactly original ideas, but that's fine because they're implemented so well here. This is an extremely refined and well-designed dungeon, and I guess it just goes to show that you don't always need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes tried and true designs and building on top of a solid foundation is more than enough, which in some ways is kind of the principle that these Oracle games adhere to in general. But seriously, that dungeon music is so great. Just northeast of Eyeglass Lake lies the Unicorn's Cave, home of the next Essence of Nature, which Link will be able to reach after yet another trip down to Subrosia. While there, he'll need to pick a bomb flower for some locals in order to reach the final chamber within the Temple of Seasons and obtain the power of autumn. Finally, the ability to control all 4 seasons is at Link's disposal, and in autumn, these stone mushrooms can be plucked, allowing entry to the next dungeon. But before we go inside, I would be remiss if I didn't quickly mention the interchangeability of the dungeon order here. Technically, you can do Dancing Dragon Dungeon and Unicorn's Cave in either order. I stuck to this order in these videos because, well, I had to choose one, and since the dungeons are quite literally numbered in these games, as indicated by the dungeon title card shown when you enter them, and the hints that the Mako tree gives you also points towards this order, so I just stuck with that. But from a strictly gameplay standpoint, once you have the flippers, there's nothing stopping you from getting the autumn power, then heading into this dungeon. You do have to go a fair amount out of your way for it. The world design is clearly streamlined in such a way to push you towards Dancing Dragon first, but as I said, technically, you can come here and do Unicorn's Cave as your 4th dungeon, and then Dancing Dragon as your 5th. And I should mention that either way you choose to do it upholds the tradition of 4th dungeons being a banger. The items from these 2 dungeons also won't gate you from the other one. The slingshot that we got in Dancing Dragon has no mandatory use case here, though I do personally find it helpful in combat, but it is not required. And as for the item we get here, since it was intended to be after Dancing Dragon by the designers, of course there's no use cases for it there. That said, while I think this is neat, a bit of deviation from the quote-unquote proper dungeon order isn't that unheard of in the Zelda series, but I felt it worth mentioning for the sake of thoroughness. Okay, with all of that said, let's head into the dungeon.
Welcome to Unicorn's Cave. I mean, yeah, I guess it is shaped like a unicorn's head if you look at the map. This is a great dungeon. I think in terms of overall size that it's a bit more condensed than Dancing Dragon, with 31 standard-sized rooms confined to a single floor, albeit with an additional 7 side-scrolling rooms. That said, size isn't everything. The dungeon may be more compact, but it makes up for that by being a somewhat labyrinthian tangled knot, with navigation being a core theme here, rather than Dancing Dragon's micro-challenges. It's not as straightforward here as picking a path and moving room to room, with areas here being sectioned off and item gated frequently. I love this sort of dungeon structure honestly, but before we get more in detail about that, let's talk about aesthetics. Despite being called Unicorn's Cave, they don't really lean into that cavernous aesthetic all that much, aside from the wall texture, which has a fairly predictable stony look. Otherwise, the dungeon feels very man-made, with its patterned floor tiles, staircases, balconies, and intricate mechanisms. I think this may be one of the better looking dungeons so far in this game at least. The music here is pretty good too. Not quite as fun as Dancing Dragon's theme, but that's a high bar. I like it though, it feels purposeful, like I'm on some kind of march towards victory. But there's also this underlying tension in there, as if you could get ambushed at any moment, but you have to just push onwards. It's good stuff, definitely one of Season's better dungeon themes. As I previously alluded to, this dungeon's progression style falls into the archetype that I affectionately refer to as the Big Tangled Knot. We've immediately got a huge amount of explorable space that is winding, twisting, and interconnected. Seriously, most of the dungeon is accessible to some degree right from the start, with 5 small keys and locked doors placed around the dungeon in critical locations, blocking access to the dungeon item, the mid-boss, the boss key, and the path towards the dungeon boss itself. So in short, this dungeon is all about exploring, zigzagging, and crisscrossing around a complicated network of rooms, finding those keys, and picking apart that big tangled knot bit by bit. If you've been keeping up with this series, you probably know this already, but this is my favorite type of dungeon, the type that almost feels like a miniature little Metroidvania. That openness is really appealing to me, but it's not so open that it lacks any substance or sequencing of any sort. I can't help but appreciate how well those locked doors are placed. It's just the right amount of restriction, done without undercutting that sense of exploration. Important things are locked off, so it feels deliberate in a way. You're incentivized to explore, to find keys, and make progress. I always find it interesting to see how many keys one can stack in their inventory within a single dungeon. Typically, the more linear a dungeon is, the fewer. In this case though, 1 key is needed for the dungeon item, but after that, you could find and hang on to the other 4 before spending any of them. And there's so much flexibility within the order that you tackle things here, but that employment of small keys means that you still have to do it all. It's still meaningful to the progression. It's also worth pointing out that the other 3 locked doors and 1 locked block, which is technically not a door, are also tucked behind obstacles that we need the item for, just as is the case with their corresponding keys, meaning that despite that you're often able to see those locked doors early, you won't be able to soft lock yourself. The key blocking access to the item has to be the first one you spend, but it's placed far into the dungeon, forcing you to explore. And yeah, not soft locking your players is like level design 101, but the more complex a dungeon is, the more impressive dancing around that soft lock really is for the developers. Speaking of which, after combing through most of the dungeon and finding our way to the northwesternmost point of the structure, we'll acquire the dungeon item, the magnetic gloves. An item so good, it genuinely is a top 5 Zelda item for me. This seriously might be one of the coolest things ever put in a video game. A simple idea that ends up having massive utility. As the name implies, the gloves are, well, magnetic, which allows you to interact with, you guessed it, other magnetic objects via their polarity. This isn't your Breath of the Wild magnesis, which had more to do with object manipulation than actual magnetism. There is still an element of that though. In case you missed the elementary school lesson on how magnets work, I'll bring you up to speed. And you can test this in real life if you have a pair of magnets. I never expected to give an actual science lesson in a Zelda video, but here we go. Magnets have a north and south pole. If you have two magnets, their opposite poles will attract. That's how magnets stick to things, or stick together. However, their matching poles will actually repel each other. Try sticking two north sides together or two south sides. You can feel them pushing each other apart. It's cool. Science. Back to Zelda. The magnetic gloves work exactly this way. Magnetic objects will have a N or S marking to indicate if they have a north or south polarity. You can change the polarity of the magnetic gloves at any time to either attract or repel objects, which allows you to manipulate them by pushing or pulling them by holding down the assigned button. However, if the object is stationary, like these cylinder things, then it's actually Link who is pushed or pulled in relation to the object, allowing you to cross over gaps or even pull yourself up to the ceiling to jump down from in these side-scrolling rooms. So cool. So what this means is that depending on the context of the object we are interacting with, whether it can be moved or not, and its polarity, that means we have the utility of items like a strength upgrade, item manipulation mechanic, and mobility-based item all rolled into one. Think of it like magnesis combined with the silver gauntlets and hookshot, all in one item. How freaking cool. With this much versatility baked right in, the sheer gameplay potential here is enormous, and it does not go unrealized. The puzzles and obstacles in this dungeon put this item to very good use. We can move these orbs onto switches to open doors. In fact, that is taught to us immediately in the room where we find the item, or we can remove them from this doorway to open the path forward, and even manipulate the orb from isolated other sections of rooms to complete puzzles, not unlike how Echoes of Wisdom would later do with its own bind puzzles. I'm particularly fond of this rotating mechanism that we first pull ourselves towards, then have to cling to and then repel from once it has turned us the correct direction, and using the glove's magnetism to push upwards off the ground in these side-scrolling sections is incredibly creative. Let's not forget its combat utility too, since you can now remove the masks from these Helmosaurs, leaving them vulnerable to attack. From a gameplay standpoint, this is truly one of the most interesting dungeon items ever conceived. The only downside is the sound it makes. Every time you use it, for the duration of its use, it emits this high-pitched tone. It is genuinely terrible. Something about the exact pitch of it makes my hair stand on end. It's so bad that I remember during my first playthrough of the game, during sequences where I would be using the glove frequently, I found myself straight up just muting the volume. If ever these Oracle games were to get a remake like Link's Awakening did, well, aside from how good of a soundtrack could potentially come out of that remake, my one singular criticism with the magnetic gloves, the sound, could be fixed. We can keep dreaming, right? Otherwise, this ends up being The Legend of Zelda: Link's Tinnitus. That aside, the item utility wonderfully opens up the rest of the dungeon, while not neglecting on creative puzzles that you need to approach from multiple angles, sometimes literally requiring us to find different entrances into the same room to solve these. So clever. Once we have the item and at least one key, we can face the dungeon mid-boss, Saiger. Yeah, he's alright, I guess. Frankly, this is a pretty forgettable mid-boss for me. Saiger tiger is a saber-toothed tiger that behaves nothing like one. He attacks by rolling into a ball and using a sonic spin dash. Okay then. His weak point is the conspicuous red orb on his tail. So really, the fight is all about avoiding or blocking his attacks, then smacking his tail with your sword enough times, and he'll go down relatively quickly. Your shield is particularly useful here. I will say that this is one of the more intuitive mid-bosses so far, but it's neither novel nor challenging like the Omoi or Agonima fights were, or even the Brother Goria with their formation-based battle in the first dungeon. This isn't to say it's bad, but it feels lacking in substance compared to what came before. I also think that a big saber-toothed tiger feels a bit out of place in a Zelda game. It always catches me off guard seeing this guy. But then again, this game also has a friendly boxing kangaroo, so it's not any weirder than that, I guess. Either way, this fight is fine. It's not bad, but it's not great either. Another note I want to touch on real quick is about Unicorn Cave's use of side-scrolling sections. These are present pretty consistently in the Game Boy titles, and I've kept my feelings on their usage for navigation no secret. That said, I think this is one of the better uses of them so far in the Oracle games. Either that or I'm softening my view on them. Hard to say, but hear me out. Usually when I have disliked these, it is because they have been used to bridge disconnected sections of the map, rather than just designing the layout and navigation in such a way to properly connect them. This can at times lead to parts of the map feeling weirdly disjointed. In Unicorn's Cave, there are 3 of these side-scrolling sections. The first one actually splits off into 2 pathways halfway through. Path A leads to this northwestern section, which is basically a disjointed part of the map, so it does fall under the category I described as one I don't really care for. Path B, that forks off from here, does naturally join back up with the main core part of the dungeon, so it's not bad. It's like a little detour and then a loop once we have the item. The other 2 sections, meanwhile, work better for me. One of them is a self-contained chamber where we'll duck down and do some side-scrolling gameplay, get the boss key, and return the way we came. So rather than being for navigation, it instead feels like a section just designed to play in this style, and it puts the dungeon item to use in a novel way that can only be achieved with this perspective. It feels more purposeful. The final passageway here is how we'll reach the boss door, so it is guilty of the same issue as the first to a degree, but at the very least it continues that novel and interesting gameplay via the magnetic gloves to balance that out, and you can reach an isolated section of this pre-boss room through normal means, and get a sort of tease here. So if you haven't found the passageway that connects here already, you'll at least figure out that that is what you need to be looking for. That you have to find the staircase that connects back to here, which isn't too far away. Though I pretty consistently find that passageway before I have the boss key, since you have to pass by it to get here, and so I end up having to turn around. So it sticks out in my head decently enough as a landmark, a point of interest to come back to, rather than muddling the navigation. And if you do find this one first, then the tease sort of works the other way too, since you can see the entrance to the other passageway. With all that said, once we've actually gotten the boss key, we can use the magnetic gloves to cross these chasms and confront the dungeon boss. Bouncing around the arena, ready to greet us, is Digdogger, the spiky eyeball urchin from the original Legend of Zelda on the NES. Since then, this has been Digdogger's only appearance, just as was the case with Aquamentus. Also as was the case with the returning NES bosses, Digdogger got a huge glow up here. By comparison, this feels far more like the idea behind his design was fully realized, and he looks great. It's just the right amount of creepy, but not outright nightmare fuel Duel. This is still a Game Boy Color game after all. In that original game, you could defeat them by playing the recorder, which caused them to split into smaller little Dig-Doggers, which could be easily dispatched. This time around, the boss has gotten a complete overhaul. It's far more mobile, leaping great distances across the room, and we must use the magnetic gloves to move this huge spike ball around the room and try to get it to collide with him. Eventually, after enough damage is dealt, he will also split into smaller little dudes, which you can then deal with, either with your sword or with the spike ball, which seems more effective from my testing, albeit harder to manage than your sword. So there's a payoff here of the harder method being more effective. If you don't deal with them fast enough, they'll reform into the big guy and need to be broken apart again, which reminds me of Valhalla from Wind Waker. Except of course that this game came first. This is a pretty fun concept, a really interesting reimagining of this classic boss. The only downside really is that it's a little too easy to accidentally damage yourself with the spike ball. It's not too bad once you've gotten the hang of it. It'll always slide a little rather than coming to an immediate stop, but either way, there's a learning curve that you must be aware of. But it's one of those things where mastery of the mechanic can really pay off, as once you do have a good understanding of it, you can turn this spike ball into an absolute force of destruction. A counterpoint, however, to my own point, is that the fight is a little too short to have the opportunity to really gain that mastery. I only got there myself because when I'm recording gameplay for these videos, I tend to fight the bosses and then reload like 3 or 4 times in a row so that I have enough footage. Either way, it may be a bit gimmicky, but I really like this fight. It's a unique twist on an old school boss, and I think it's kind of a shame that we haven't seen a new version of Dig-Dogger since this game, like we have with, say, Goma. And a modern adaptation of Dig-Dogger could be a genuinely scary boss if done right, even if Big Eyeball Monster as a concept is a bit overdone. Once he's defeated, and he's defeated, and he's defeated, and he's defeated, and he's defeated, we'll find the nurturing warmth. The 5th essence of nature. Unless you did this one before Dancing Dragon, then I guess it would be your 4th. So, overall, this revisit to Unicorn's Cave really surprised me. It was never a dungeon that stuck out in my memory like Dancing Dragon did, but I really like it. It does just about everything right. There's tons of those little treasure chest teases, like we saw in Poison Moth's lair, and a wonderful sense of satisfaction to be had when you start picking that tangled knot apart and figure out how you can get past all those obstacles that you couldn't before. The amount of puzzles the dungeon lets you catch a glimpse of before you find the solution in the form of the dungeon item is huge. I always like that sort of thing. It may be a slightly smaller dungeon in literal size, but because the navigation is just a little more complex than the prior dungeons, it more than makes up for it. There may be only one floor, but I love that meticulous Metroidvania style progression. That and the way the dungeon is so nicely interconnected, looping in on itself, it's great. I also have to applaud the way the dungeon finds time to keep old ideas relevant as usual. There's far less of a reliance on minecarts here, but they still find a place for them and the track switching, even if it is just in a small early section. Same goes for using the flippers. These returning elements keep the early moments through the dungeon interesting, before the second half of the dungeon runs with its own new mechanics, that being the use of the magnetic gloves, which genuinely may be one of the best dungeon items ever dreamed up. And after you've got those gloves, the rest of the dungeon opens up to you, letting you run freely, solve puzzles that you couldn't before, and round up keys. I alluded to the dungeon shape earlier, and I've been finding it interesting to compare these dungeons to the dungeons of the original Legend of Zelda. I think there is a vague similarity to the lion dungeon from that game, albeit flipped horizontally, but it may be a bit of a reach. Either way, I will say that I think this is the last dungeon in the game to have any remnants of that Zelda 1 remake that I mentioned way back when we were looking at Gnarled Root. That is, if this one even does have any relation here, or there's a decent chance that it is just a coincidence. You can only make animal faces look so different when drawing them out with map tiles after all, so don't expect me to keep bringing Zelda 1 dungeons up going forward, unless I find a point that's really relevant. A couple more stray thoughts I have. There's this one puzzle here in this room, where the room is divided in half. The two statues in here are magically connected in a way, so when you push this one, the other one also moves, but its movements are inverted. So we have to get statue number 2 to press down the switch on the other side of the room by pushing statue number 1 around. This is a super cool concept. I love this sort of puzzle. It's not overly complicated here. It shouldn't take you more than a moment to do, but it's so mechanically sound. My only critique is that the field of view is so limited that you can't actually see the switch when you solve the puzzle. So there's a sense of satisfaction that feels a little undercut. There's also this puzzle in which we need to remember the order that we kill these 4 Armos in, and then open the 4 treasure chests that appear in that same order. This is a puzzle that also plays to the strength of Season's action-oriented gameplay, because if you aren't good at managing combat and defeating these guys efficiently, they'll go ham and get mixed up all over the room. You have to control the battlefield here and be deliberate, or you'll lose track of the order. It's neat. Also, I can't figure out the point of this little balcony in this room right before we get the dungeon item. I think it would make sense if these push blocks could only be moved from the backside, so we'd have to jump down into this room from the balcony, and by extension we'd be forced to fight our way past the enemies in this room. But that's not the case. We can just push the blocks and then we're right beside the locked door and able to bypass all those P-hats and water Tektites. I don't know, it's hardly a big deal, but I always end up looping around the room twice because it throws me off and I don't want to miss anything. Regardless, Unicorn's Cave is solid. The only major fault here as far as I'm concerned is the absolutely abysmal sound that the magnetic gloves make. It's so bad it's almost painful. Is that melodramatic to say? But that is really the only bad thing here. Everything else feels like nitpicking. Besides, the way the item is actually used, the way the dungeon is laid out, and the way we progress through here, unravel it and solve puzzles, this may otherwise be a damn near perfect dungeon.
North of Spool Swamp lies Tarm Ruins. 4 unique jewels are required to open this ancient gate, which will lead us into the Lost Woods. But after navigating both the woods and the seasons themselves alike, we'll eventually find ourselves at the northwesternmost corner of Holodrum. High upon the peak of the mountain, we'll find a massive tower, which will serve as the next dungeon. Welcome to the Ancient Ruins. A rather uninteresting name for such a good dungeon, if you ask me. Ancient Ruins just sounds generic, like it was a placeholder name that they left in there, which is surprising given the naming conventions of this game have otherwise been either an allusion to the layout or at least relevant to its location in some way. I would have called it something like Tarm Tower, but I digress. Overall though, the dungeon does have strong theming. The color palette and architecture evoke, well, ancient ruins, I guess. But specifically, I get a desert temple sort of vibe from the place. The walls and floors have that beigey color that makes it look like sandstone, and the place is brimming with traps more than any other of Season's dungeons so far. Avoiding traps feels like a core theme here. Between that and the enemies present here, such as the Gibdos, Stalfos, Keese, Armo statues that come to life, and snakes.
Actually, those are called...
I know they're called ropes. This feels like the sort of place you'd see in an Indiana Jones film, and I mean that in the best way. The only issue is that this sort of leads to something of an identity crisis within the dungeon. It feels so much like a decrepit desert temple, but its placement is on the opposite side of the overworld map from the desert. We get here by crossing through the Lost Woods and climbing the mountain. It's bizarre. I think this is a good dungeon, but it also feels out of place in a way. This is a pretty large dungeon, much larger than Unicorn's Cave and even a bit bigger than Dancing Dragon. There's a total of 45 standard-sized rooms, 46 if you count the rooftop balcony where we get the essence, with the largest being the bottom floor, and each floor getting a bit smaller as you go up. I would hazard a guess, based on the way the floor sizes shrink going up, that the dungeon was initially conceived as a pyramid when planning, but that this ended up not quite being feasible as the game was beholden to the grid of the dungeon map. That's just a guess though. Between that and the architecture I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that this dungeon was moved sometime during development. Maybe it was originally meant to be in the desert. Who knows? The music is also just okay. It isn't super catchy like the last two dungeons, but it also doesn't get annoying. It does manage to fit the mysterious vibe pretty well though. So yeah, it's decent. A good mid-tier dungeon theme. Mysterious and not too intrusive. As for progression, this is really where the Ancient Ruins shines. The dungeon being a tower is reflected both in the layout as well as the exterior of the entrance. I'm not sure what it is, but tower dungeons are always fun. The first floor is a bit more exploration focused, being an open space that allows you to explore, unravel, and loop about a key central area. After that, the floors upstairs get a little more linear, though they're not without some backtracking and zigzagging around. Many of the puzzle mechanics found here act sort of as sequels to those we've seen before, building off of concepts introduced in previous dungeons, and that's not a bad thing. The difficulty is escalating in this dungeon. Notably, on the first floor, the turnstile makes a return, and it is implemented wonderfully. Pretty well the entirety of floor 1's navigation is designed around this thing, and as I mentioned when we were looking at Snake's Remains, I adore this mechanic. The room layouts loop back in on themselves in both directions, with the western passage being obstructed by a critically placed locked block. Learning to manipulate this turnstile to your advantage and approach it from the correct direction is crucial to successfully navigating through the first floor, and it becomes so immensely satisfying to do, especially once you have the small key that you need to open that western passage up. We also get a fair amount of magnetic glove puzzles, though it's not used for traversal as much this time around, but there are a bunch of orbs to place onto switches. Of course, as tower dungeons tend to, it uses verticality quite effectively, building off of the puzzles from Poison Moth's Lair, frequently having us drop down to lower floors and having to move trampolines into position to bounce back up to the correct spot of the floor above. It's good stuff. Tucked in the southeastern corner of floor 3 is the dungeon item, the magical boomerang. It is functionally just an upgrade for your existing boomerang, outright replacing it in your inventory, but it is a pretty big change. The magical boomerang can be controlled directly by holding the button and using the D-pad to manipulate it, making it useful for puzzles. It's pretty cool, honestly. Though I find it a bit tricky to control, it's a great idea and implemented as well as it could be for the hardware, with gem switches strategically placed over chasms and around obstacles. But with the power of hindsight, I think this is one thing that gets iterated on nicely in later games, such as the DS Zelda titles, which had a more intuitive control scheme for this item specifically. It also packs more of a punch than your old boomerang, being strong enough to kill tough enemies like the Armos that spring to life in the very room that to find it in. As a bit of a side note, I feel like they make you fight or at least encounter a bunch of Armos without it, just to make using the boomerang more satisfying. And if that is the case, then they succeeded. It totally works. It always feels good to find a weapon that makes tough enemies go down faster. The dungeon mid-boss is the Vire, and he's fine. He's a recycled mid-boss based on the Vire from Link's Awakening. Really, all you have to do is keep your sword ready, be patient, and wait for him to get close to you, and he'll go down pretty fast, especially if you got the noble sword before this dungeon. But yeah, Vire is a bit mediocre in terms of mid-bosses. Not bad, just not great either. I mentioned before that a big part of the dungeon's theming is all about avoiding traps, and I stand by that. There's a ton of these. From basic spikes in the floor, to blade traps, to rolling spike traps, Armos that come to life, ambushing you, and arrows being shot from the walls. It makes for a dangerous dungeon setting for sure, but it's also mechanically and thematically a nice shakeup. All of this culminates in a huge set piece, one that rewards us with the boss key. Feeding into that Indiana Jones vibe, the game presents to us this tantalizing giant rupee. When you grab the rupee, the trap activates. You have to quickly make your way through this huge obstacle course-like room filled with hazards. All the while, the room itself starts collapsing, the walls closing in around you. It's almost like an escape sequence, but on a smaller scale. If you don't get there in time, then you get squashed. This is cool. You don't see this type of thing in a Zelda dungeon often. It's just a nice bit of tension before you get the boss key and finish up the dungeon. With all of that said, once we have made our way past all of these obstacles and traps and completed this little puzzle on the top floor, we can confront the dungeon boss. Lying in wait for us is Manhandla. And this is an interesting reinterpretation of this boss, though not my favorite if I'm being honest. In comparison to its NES counterpart, this is for sure an improvement. But later games like Echoes of Wisdom and even the Four Swords games, I think end up offering more fleshed out and interesting versions of the boss. But I digress. I definitely like the visual improvements here over the original NES appearance. The main body, stem of the plant resembles a buzz blob and even electrocutes you, so you'll want to make use of that newly acquired magic boomerang to keep some distance. The heads, or flowers I guess, look like basically piranha plants, which I guess is in line with how the original Zelda 1 manual described Manhandla anyways. They even spit fireballs. So yeah, in essence, you gotta use your boomerang to destroy the 4 heads, then strike at the body to reveal its final weak point, and deliver the coup de grace. Simple enough. The main challenge here comes from how difficult the arena is to maneuver around in. Since half of the room has this shifting treadmill floor, I will give Manhandla some credit though. They're the first dungeon boss in this game to actually genuinely drop my heart down to 0. I don't remember them giving me this much trouble on previous playthroughs, but hey, here we are. I kind of like them all the more just for that. But I don't really have much more to say about Manhandla. It's mid-tier in how I would rank the bosses in this game, as well as in how I would rank Manhandla's series-wide appearances. Not bad by any means, but not great, just squarely good. Once he's defeated, we'll be able to head up to the rooftop and find the Blowing Wind, the 6th essence of nature. So overall, Ancient Ruins is a competently designed dungeon. It has a lot of great set pieces and good puzzles. My main point of contention with the dungeon is that it feels thematically at odds with itself, like it was a dungeon meant for a different part of the game or something. One that got repurposed or just moved around at some point during development. I don't know that for sure, it's just how it feels playing through here. But taken in isolation, judged on its own merits, I still think this dungeon is great. That thematic incongruity is not anywhere near enough to hold it back. A few more thoughts I have. In the southeast corner of floor 2 is a completely pointless trap room. I don't like that. I guess I'm of the mindset that exploring every corner of a dungeon should be rewarded, though I guess it could be argued that it is on brand for the dungeon's trap-filled theme. I would just rather there still be something in there, even if it were an optional treasure chest with money. On the flip side, there is a hidden room on floor 1, just below here, that sort of balances it out as a secret cash-filled room. Also, there is this room with the super fast green blade traps. This is the first time I've seen this game lag and drop frames. I guess it's just a little too much for the Game Boy to handle. It's not even that there's a lot going on in here, I don't think so at least. Maybe the overall speed of the blade traps just pushes the hardware to its limits. All that aside, I do think that the best part of this dungeon overall is just how effectively it makes use of its space, especially that verticality. Something about dropping to the floor below, then repositioning the trampolines to bounce back upstairs to the correct spot in order to complete a puzzle is so satisfying. And of course, the use of the turnstile in the early moments of this dungeon is just fantastic. Both of these are great ways to test the player's spatial awareness, even more so than what we saw in Poison Moth's Lair. I just love this stuff. Plus, I appreciate that we get a nice balance of open floor plan, especially on the bottom floor, and tight linear segments upstairs. But of course, vibes are so important. I am a sucker for a dungeon with a good sense of atmosphere, and I think that plays a big part in how this dungeon excels. It being so filled with hazards and traps makes the player feel like an archaeologist exploring a dangerous, forbidden, forgotten place. As I said earlier in this video, it's that Indiana Jones vibe, a feeling I don't think the series would fully embrace again until Tears of the Kingdom's Lightning Temple. So while it's a bit out of place feeling in some ways, this dungeon is overall solid. I like it a lot. In the depths of Subrosia, an undead crew of pirates is stranded and slowly losing their sea legs. Old Captain is distressed by the loss of his precious bell, and their ship stuck transdimensionally between the surface world and the shore of Subrosia. After helping one of the pirates sent out to search for the bell in Samasa Desert, then having the Subrosian master smithies polish it back to good condition, we can join the pirates as they once again set sail. That is, until they all get seasick and have to dock nearby. However, they've brought us close enough to where we need to go. Convenient. Their ship will act as a bridge between Horon Village and the nearby graveyard, where we'll find the next dungeon. Welcome to the Explorer's Crypt, an aptly named dungeon for one placed in the corner of a graveyard. And might I just add that this dungeon is wonderful. But let's start with the aesthetics. Things here are pretty good. We have solid visual theming with a unique floor and wall tile set, and cohesive color palette. The place is, as the name implies, a crypt. And while there could have been greater strides made to imply that in the architecture itself, I think overall that there's enough in here to support that, particularly with these graves, which are important for both the atmosphere as well as the upcoming puzzles. Additionally, the dungeon's overall shape forms a skull, or rather 3 different skulls, one for each of its 3 floors. While it may not be the most visually striking place, considering the hardware it was made for, it gets by no problem if you ask me. My favorite part of the visuals here is the use use of darkness, which adds to the spooky atmosphere, as well as contributes to those same aforementioned puzzles. We'll circle back to that in a moment though. The music here is pretty decent too. Of course, it's not going to be super catchy, but it's clear they were going for a more spooky sort of ambient feeling with this track, which I think they pulled off pretty wonderfully, especially with the use of echo. That said, it's not so ambient that it lacks any sort of rhythm. There's an element of danger that comes through pretty clear as the track goes through the motions, swinging between calm and spooky, and those brief moments where things pick up. It all makes your trek through here feel tense and uncertain in a way that I think works to the dungeon's benefit. Contrary to what you may expect for a late-game dungeon, Explorer's Crypt doesn't actually continue to scale up in size compared to the prior few dungeons. There are 3 floors here, which total in at 39 standard-sized rooms. However, despite being physically smaller, the navigation and puzzles in here are more complex than what came before, making the crypt still feel like an appropriate escalation in challenge. It is such a meticulously designed dungeon with basically no wasted space, no rooms just for the sake of having more rooms. Everything is put to use. I think that in this game, this is the first dungeon to make use of what I've often called the 3-act structure. Dancing Dragon got kind of close, but it was a lot more smaller chunks. Like other dungeons in this style, each of the crypt's 3 floors have a prominent section that you'll explore around in before moving on to the next section, with typically very little reason to backtrack to a previous section. Though the 3 acts don't quite cleanly divide by floor like it would in, say, A Link to the Past's Turtle Rock or Ocarina of Time's Shadow Temple, since this dungeon uses its verticality so darn effectively. Rather, there are curated sections of each floor that you'll visit in various orders as you bounce up and down, but there isn't a singular core central room or area that you'll be crisscrossing throughout the entirety of the dungeon. Instead, there's a constant sense of pressing onwards, containing a winding series of branching paths, forks in the road, corridors that loop in on themselves, and important obstacles to take mental notes of and revisit after obtaining the dungeon item or completing a puzzle. I've talked before about the old treasure chest tease, the idea of being able to see a tantalizing treasure chest that you can't reach yet, something to tease you, which makes it all the more satisfying when you do finally get to open it up. And honestly, I think that is the core conceit of Explorer's Crypt, a sense of setup and payoff. Constantly, the dungeon is showing you things, not just treasure chests, but sometimes a puzzle you need to approach from another angle, or an obstacle you don't yet have the means to pass. Sometimes it's even something as simple as a locked door or block that you're made to walk past, or a portion of a room that is sectioned off. And of course, yes, a couple of treasure chests that you can't reach yet. Regardless, the concept remains the same. The dungeon constantly demands that you pay attention and take note of your surroundings. In fact, I sort of had to remind myself that this was supposed to be the quote-unquote action game between the two, because this dungeon is so heavily focused around puzzles and navigation. Not that Oracle of Seasons hasn't had any of those elements, mind you, but it's not as much the focus here compared to Oracle of Ages. Either way, it's nice to have a taste of that in this game, especially one done so well. At the risk of sounding redundant, another really great aspect of this dungeon is how it builds off of previously established concepts, and finds time to put your previously acquired items to use. Puzzles and obstacles that use the magnetic gloves? Check. Those rolling cylinders from Snake's Remains? Check. Torches to light? Check in a big important way. Statue moving puzzles with restrictions that require forethought and spatial reasoning? Definitely a check. And most notably perhaps, using trampolines to bounce to other floors and reach new areas, like in Poison Moth's Lair and Ancient Ruins? The biggest check of them all.
the Crypt has the best use of this mechanic yet. Various puzzles require you to move the trampolines into the correct position, but that correct position must first be discerned by checking upstairs in order to understand the space. Previous dungeons have typically had a visual tell, such as a conspicuously different floor tile to indicate where to push the trampoline to. That was all building up to this. This time that idea is turned on its head. Sometimes that visual tell is absent, and sometimes it's a red herring, only putting you into position to scope out the room above, not tell you where to push the trampoline to. You need to see how far that correct spot is from up here, move it into position, then bounce up. This also gets further built upon with these red trampolines, which are strong enough to bounce you up 2 entire floors, taking these spatial reasoning puzzles quite literally to the next level. A singular puzzle can now be split up among all 3 of the dungeon's floors. Furthermore, there are entirely isolated rooms on the map that are only reachable by finding your way to either the room above or below and traveling vertically. I've talked at length before about dungeons having a disjointed feeling, and I guess I just don't experience that here with this mechanic, compared to, say, the side-scrolling sections that have otherwise been used in many of the game's other dungeons. They're notably absent here and in the ancient ruins before this, and I think that these 2 dungeons are actually better for it, avoiding that disjointed feeling by connecting the rooms vertically rather than artificially. Another great feature that makes this dungeon stand out is its inclusion of the Poe sisters, not the quartet from the likes of the Forest Temple and Arbiter's Grounds, but rather a duo. Despite there being half as many of them here compared to those other examples, the 2 that we get are far more involved in the dungeon. They are central to several puzzles, as well as working in tandem with the level design to funnel you in the correct direction. Let's look at the specifics. First, there is this room on the top floor. This room is cursed. There are 4 torches that go out in quick succession, acting as a countdown, a verbal warning included. If you are in the room when all the lights go out, you get warped back to the dungeon entrance. That said, the other paths you've encountered have been locked off. This is the only way to progress. In this room, there are 3 paths immediately available. A bombable wall to the left, a staircase past these obstacles in the center of the room, and a doorway to the right. Due to the countdown, however, only that right side path is actually viable. Even with Pegasus seeds, these obstacles just take too long to work past. So we take the right path, which nets us the key that we need for a door we passed by earlier. This of course loops us back to this ledge where we can light these torches to break the curse on that room. By the way, this owl statue actually hints at this with the line, "The source of the curse is hidden in darkness." With the curse broken, we actually will be able to properly comb through those other paths. A similar thing happens on the floor below. The cursed room down here takes too long to swim through, and we'll need a key to open the other path in this central chamber, so we're funneled elsewhere to find it first. So that progression style looks like you have a bunch of paths to take, but you have to know where to start to pick each mini knot apart. Find the key to open the door that leads to the sister's grave to break the curse to be able to reach the next floor. I just love this sort of puzzle navigation design. Breaking these curses also triggers a brief skirmish with each sister, though despite their big talk, neither of them are particularly tough, but it does help develop a small sort of rivalry with these characters. Of course, this ends up culminating in the dungeon mid-boss, which is a battle against both sisters at once. And this is a pretty fast-paced, frenetic fight, which demands you keep an eye on the state of the arena itself. The 2 sisters will continually attempt to extinguish the torches in this room, which, as you'd expect, will warp you back to the entrance if all 4 are put out. So, in addition to avoiding their attacks and trying to strike back, you have to manage keeping those torches torches lit as well. Between that unique twist on the fight and the way the Crypt has built them up already, this makes for perhaps the most memorable mid-boss fight in the game. It's my personal favorite. It is already fun to come out of a battle victorious, but when your opponents have been harassing you all the way through the dungeon up until this point, it's all the more satisfying. It's that setup and payoff. Speaking of payoff, the dungeon item here is the Rock's Cape. This is a fun one, but of course I'm always a fan of items that improve your mobility or make moving about more interesting. The Rock's Cape is basically an upgrade to your existing Rock's Feather, allowing you to jump over much larger gaps, especially when combined with your Pegasus Seeds, which you will need for at least one puzzle. The dungeon has been having us trod past various gaps and chasms that we couldn't cross before, but now can with the increased jumping distance and added control. Or rather, I guess it's more of a jump and glide. Either way, this adds an interesting platforming element to some of these rooms, and despite being so generous in terms of sheer jump distance, that's no problem for such a late game item if you ask me. Though 2 dungeon items in a row essentially being upgrades to existing items is a little less exciting than just finding unique new tools, but it is nowhere near a deal breaker, especially considering just how fun it is to use this thing. It's implemented well, it works. So with all of that said, after delving deeper into the depths of this crypt and solving this multi-floor puzzle involving these gem switches and later this staircase labyrinth, we can confront the dungeon boss. Nestled between 2 sections of spike traps is the massive, multi-headed Gleeok with a twist. We'll get back to the twist in a moment though. As I've mentioned in my coverage of the first few dungeons of this game, Oracle of Seasons began development as a remake of the original Legend of Zelda, and there have been many holdover elements from that stage of development in the game's dungeons. Unless there's something that I'm forgetting or that I missed in the upcoming areas, Gleeok here just may be the last of those holdovers to appear in this game. While various versions of Gleeoks have appeared, though with nowhere near the frequency of, say, Goma, most recently showing up in Tears of the Kingdom and Age of Imprisonment, this is Gleeok's first reappearance since the NES version, and unfortunately, he didn't quite get as significant of a glow-up as his contemporaries did. I think his appearance is fairly comparable to his Zelda 1 sprite, a little better even. He's a bit more rotund now, and he's lost the spines on his back, but he certainly doesn't look bad for a Game Boy Color sprite. But compared to the likes of Aquamentus, Dodongo, Goma, Dick Dogger, and Manhandla, Gleeok pales in comparison, lacking a lot of the expressiveness and level of detail that those other bosses had, which is too bad. So in terms of visuals, Gleeok's base appearance is just okay. This is still a pretty fun battle though. Gleeok's body remains stationary while his heads sway and shoot fire blasts at you, and when you've struck his weak point, his heads enough, they'll detach and ricochet around the arena. So between that and the fire blasts, this makes the fight overall fairly chaotic. Bullet hellish even. The Rock's Cape isn't necessary here, but is quite useful for avoiding these attacks, thanks to the increased mobility it offers. If you're not quick enough, his heads can also reattach, so there's a sense of urgency added to the battle as well, which I personally find fun. Now, the twist. Just when you think you've destroyed Gleeok, there's a surprise second phase. His flesh falls away and his headless skeleton remains. Everything I complained about with his base form is not applicable here. This sprite is detailed and creepy, and you'll need to use the Rock's Cape to avoid his charging attacks, which can stun you if you don't jump in time, with him charging directly at you, shaking the room. This second phase is such a fun little surprise, and works as a great way to play on the expectations of longtime fans who were expecting a straightforward retread of Gleeok
Brock's Zelda 1 counterpart. So, overall, this is a great boss fight. One that begs the question, how come we didn't get a Stalgliok in Tears of the Kingdom? Once he's defeated, we'll find the Seed of Life, the 7th essence of nature. So overall, Explorer's Crypt is a fantastic dungeon, one that goes to great lengths to have spooky and memorable set pieces, a strong theme, and puzzles that make you feel oh so clever for solving them. There's a fair amount of backtracking, but in a good way, where you'll either have to hold in your head the location of a locked door or Rock's Cape obstacle until the right time, or you'll be zigzagging around a fork in the road, or even just getting looped back to a previous room. The only thing this dungeon really lacks is a core central room, which is already a tall order for a 3-act dungeon like this, but that's no big deal honestly because it executes so well on everything. And while I tend to like those bigger picture dungeons, this being one that pushes you onward constantly, deeper into its depths, is a welcome one, especially when the theme is supposed to be spooky. Still, for Seasons being the action game, it's just such a pleasure to get some real brain teasers that make me stop and have to consider the mechanics. I particularly like the puzzle in this room. There are 8 Armos statues that are moved by pressing down the switches around the room. The goal is to arrange them into a square surrounding the center tile, but each switch can only be pressed once. I am not ashamed to say that I had to reset the room a couple of times. This is such a clever little moment. First, you have to figure out how you're even meant to arrange them, and then piece together the sequence in which you need to press the switches. There's also this puzzle which houses the boss key. If this were a 3D Zelda, then this would be one huge vertical chamber, but in the world of top-down Zelda, it's basically just 3 rooms stacked on top of each other. You have to bounce up from basement 2. There's a hint to the puzzle solution from the owl statue on the top floor, and several gem switches spread around basement 1. Hitting a few switches to form the correct pattern isn't exactly a revolutionary puzzle concept, but spreading these elements across 3 interconnected floors turns what is otherwise a pretty standard puzzle into a novel one. I like it. In the western room of basement 2, there's a chasm that you can't cross right away. In order to extend the bridge, you must first defeat all the enemies in the room. Simple enough. Except that 2 of the dark nuts are on the other side of the gap. It isn't out of the realm of possibility to use some sort of ranged attack, but I ended up pulling them into the abyss using the magnetic gloves. I cannot express how hilarious of a combat solution this is to me. I'm not sure if it's the intended way. I'm not even sure why I thought to try it. Maybe it's because they're colored red and blue, like all of the magnetic stuff the glove has been able to interact with, as well as the glove itself, and there's a bunch of magnetic blocks just a room over, but regardless, that's just how I did it. And I have no regrets. Let me know in the comments if you got them a different way. When I streamed this game back in 2024, I completely cheesed this with the boomerang, and I kind of hate that. Though there's a couple of small annoyances, such as puzzles not staying complete when you leave a room. For example, this puzzle in which there is one random Armos that you must push onto a switch to open the door. Well, the rest will come alive to attack you. You have to pass through here a few times and redo the puzzle every time. It doesn't take too long, and this is likely just a hardware limitation, but it is still a small nuisance. Regardless, overall this dungeon is really great. Despite having so many branching paths, the dungeon remains very navigable, thanks to the process of elimination funneling you towards its various keys. Dead ends and those cursed rooms work to send you back to explore other paths and make progress. The atmosphere remains the right amount of spooky and mysterious, and the mid-bosses being incorporated throughout the dungeon before you fight them remains a highlight for me. It's all of these little moments of setup and payoff, teasing you and then rewarding you, building things up before giving you that satisfaction. So add all of these up, and Explorer's Crypt remains a top-tier dungeon.
In the northern reaches of Holodrum, between Tarm Ruins and Mount Kuko, rests the ruins of the Temple of Seasons, or at least the portion that had not fallen down into Subrosia. Using our newly acquired Rockscape and our ability to control the flow of the seasons themselves, we can explore the ruins in earnest and find our way through this portal into the mountains of Subrosia. After setting off some, fireworks, we'll be able to make our way to this peculiar volcanic structure, which for some reason has eyes. This is, of course, the entrance to the next dungeon. Welcome to the Sword and Shield Maze, the only dungeon found in Subrosia. And right off the bat, I will say that this is a pretty solid dungeon. A great one even. Maybe not as cohesive as Explorer's Crypt or Unicorn's Cave, but a well thought out dungeon regardless. Is it a fire dungeon? Is it an ice dungeon? Yes. And also yes. The main gimmick of Sword and Shield Maze is navigating between two interconnected floors that are thematically opposites to each other, with the top floor, the shield, being pretty firmly ice-themed, slippery ice physics and all, while the bottom floor, the sword, fills the fire theme, with magma-filled pits and flame-powered enemies. The dungeon aesthetics, of course, are made to reflect this. The floor tiles upstairs use either stony cobblestone or thick sheets of ice, with frosted-over walls to match. Downstairs, meanwhile, has porous rocky walls and fine, ornate floor tiles to contrast this. Even the two side-scrolling sections stay on theme for the two floors they are found in. And of course, the dungeon shape of Sword and Shield Maze is, well, that of a sword and shield. Who would have thought? The color palettes are on point to match, of course, too. Even color theory plays a part in this, with orange being perceived as an aggressive color to represent the sword, where blue is a more calm one, which could be seen as a more defensive one, being the shield. All that is to say, yeah, visually, everything is pretty much perfect for what the dungeon's theme is. The dungeon music, meanwhile, is a little less perfect. I mean, on paper, I think it makes sense. I'm just not super into the execution here. The track essentially has two main sections that it alternates between. A dangerous low section, which I personally headcanon to represent the fire part of the dungeon. And a higher pitched section, which has the ascending and descending sort of feeling, which I feel represents the dungeon's ice element. The first part is decent enough dungeon music. Nothing fantastic, but not terrible, just a pretty average dungeon theme. The second part, though, it actually irritates me. It's just too repetitive and high-pitched for my taste, and the fact that it repeats so often in one of the game's longest dungeons, no less. Needless to say, I got pretty tired of it pretty fast. Before anybody goes to defend it by reminding me that this is Game Boy music, I will remind you that this hardware has not stopped other dungeon themes from being bangers. Look at Face Shrine in Link's Awakening, or Dancing Dragon and Explorer's Crypt earlier in this game. I'm judging this piece with the fact that it is Game Boy music in mind already. This one just doesn't really do it for me. Like Explorer's Crypt before this, I would categorize the navigation of Sword and Shield Maze as a 3-act dungeon, with some pretty clean divisions. The first act spans the western portion of the dungeon, in which you'll make your initial trek through half of the first floor, and then make your way down to the basement. This is the most linear of the 3 acts by far. Act 2 is a more puzzle navigation style section, revolving mostly around the turnstile room in the southernmost chamber of Basement 1. This section will put your sense of space to the test as you manipulate and maneuver not just through and around the turnstile, but weave between the two floors back and forth in order to solve puzzles, get the dungeon item, and then take on the dungeon's mid-boss. We'll come back to this guy in a bit, but he's rad. The third and final act more or less combines the two playstyles of the previous two. There's some puzzles and linear exploration, which eventually loops in on itself and takes you into this complicated final set piece. This set piece utilizes the two interconnected floors idea and throws a twisting minecart labyrinth on top of that, which requires you to bring 4 magic ice crystals to set locations in order to cool the lava below. It's my favorite part of the dungeon, putting so many of the skills that the game has taught you to use, while also adding a brand new puzzle element to the mix, all the while still being perfectly suited to the dungeon's themes. So, between those 3 acts, what's the underlying idea, the thematic through line? I'd argue that it is spatial awareness and gaining an understanding of the interconnectivity between the dungeon's floors. If that sounds like the underlying idea of several dungeons that we've already covered here, well, I guess that's because it sort of is. However, Sword and Shield Maze examines this same concept through different means and different mechanics. The trampolines that I have very much adored seeing appear throughout some of the previous dungeons are not here, but that's okay because we don't risk overusing them. Instead, there are staircases connecting the top and bottom floor all over the place, and puzzles that will take you back and forth between them constantly. Most importantly, though, is the interplay between that and the 2 elemental themes here, which especially comes to fruition during the dungeon's final big set piece, as you can only change the conditions of the bottom floor by interacting with the puzzles on the top floor. It's all so meticulous in a way that I love.
Hello folks, my name is Nehru. My deep and abiding love for the Oracle games isn't exactly a secret, and I'm sure my choice to represent myself as a Subrosian gives away my preference for Oracle of Seasons. Captain Bergerson has very graciously asked me to take part in his dungeon design series, and my choice of dungeon was clear from the very start. The Sword and Shield Maze. It's my favorite dungeon from my favorite top-down Zelda game, and I could talk about it endlessly. How much I love the Fire and Ice thematics, how masterfully it implements navigational complexity, how wonderfully designed many of the individual puzzle rooms are, but for the sake of brevity, I'll stick to glazing one aspect of this dungeon, which is actually contrary to a criticism held by many in regards to the Game Boy games. I truly appreciate how the Sword and Shield Maze requires the player to utilize a significant number of items. While most dungeons tend to stick to focusing around the dungeon item and maybe a secondary mainstay item like the hookshot in Ocarina of Time, the Sword and Shield dungeon keeps you on your toes. You'll use a bomb to clear the way for a magnet ball, which will require the magnetic gloves, only after using gale shots from your boomerang to clear away the hard hat beetles. In the next room, you'll use your magical boomerang to defeat the sparks, and later on you'll make liberal use of the Rock's Cape and Power Bracelet. While I often find that the final dungeon in a Zelda game often lacks any meaningful feeling of finality, that is very much not the case here. The Sword and Shield Maze truly feels as though it's asking the player to look at their inventory and think about how the different items can be used to get you through devious puzzles. I think that's fantastic. However, I do know this is an area in which many folks disagree with me. I'm certainly aware that many cite frequent item swapping as a point of contention in the Game Boy games. They argue that the limitations of the Game Boy being such that only 2 items can ever be equipped at a time, and considering you almost always want the sword equipped, means you really only have one single item equipped at a time. Go to a room that needs 3 different items, and you're pausing to swap items 3 different times. To many, this absolutely kills the pace. This is a very fair complaint. I simply favor ambition over convenience. There's no doubt that constant item switching is exhausting, same as dealing with the iron boots in N64 Ocarina of Time. For me though, there's no universe in which I would want to trade away that extra design depth for convenience. Ideally, we'll get a remaster or remake one day that'll allow the player to carry more items, like in the 2019 Link's Awakening remake, but even as is, with the severe limitations of the Game Boy, I'm happy to deal with the tedium. Thank you, Captain, for giving me the chance to come on here and talk about my favorite dungeon.
The dungeon item here is the Hyper Slingshot, which for the third dungeon in a row is an upgrade to an existing item. It's the Slingshot again, but now it's Hyper. That is to say it shoots a spread of 3 projectiles rather than a single one, greatly improving its combat and puzzle utility. There's only a couple of puzzles in here that use it, including an optional one pretty close to the start of the dungeon that you can backtrack for, in which you need to strike multiple targets simultaneously. That's about it. I do think this item is cool, but it feels a little underutilized and isn't anywhere near as fun as something like the Magnetic Glove or utterly game-changing as the Rocks Cape, which fundamentally changes how you interact with the entire rest of the game. Then again, saying this item isn't quite as cool as 2 of the most novel and fun items in the series is hardly a fair critique, so it's alright. It will come in handy during the dungeon's mid-boss, however. This guy is called Fry Polar, which is a pun that works on multiple levels, since he's a dual elemental style mid-boss. Fry like hot, but polar like cold, but also polar like polar opposites. This mid-boss battle is a pretty fun one that is perfectly on theme with this dungeon. Fry Polar swaps between a fire and ice state, with elemental attacks to accompany them. When he's ablaze, you can use mystery seeds to force him to switch to his ice state, and then in turn deal damage using your ember seeds. When he switches back to his fire state, you can hurl the ice shards that he dropped in his other form back at him to deal damage that way. Just make sure to hit those with mystery seeds too before you do. Overall, I love this fight, and for a Game Boy Color sprite, I think he looks pretty good too. Plus the fire and ice dual elemental battle is a trope that I frankly never get tired of. The only issue I have here is that the pacing of the battle is somewhat throttled by the game's inventory management system, but I guess I did say that I wasn't going to complain about inventory management anymore, didn't I? Still, it's a case of ambitious design on limited hardware, and I can't help but admire that. Overall, Seasons has had some pretty hit or miss mid-bosses, but this one is definitely among the better ones. With all of that said, once we've found the boss key from the Eastern Wings stretch of floor 1 and successfully cooled the magma flooding the central chambers of the basement, we can confront the dungeon boss. Appearing in front of us is Medusa Head. Alright, bit on the nose, but I see why they named you that. Medusa Head is a visually striking enemy for sure. This is such a detailed and angry looking sprite. They did a great job on the aesthetics here. Medusa Head will also employ the tried and true tactic of flying around the room and hurling projectiles at you. Mostly, these are fireballs it spits out, but it occasionally will use these blue energy orbs to petrify you, Medusa style. Thankfully, it's only temporary. My favorite of their attacks is when they unleash these huge lasers and sweep across the room like this, which you can use the Rocks Cape to leap over. It's so satisfying to avoid successfully. The slingshot can be used to momentarily stun them too, but I found it most effective to just have at it with my sword, especially if you're good at timing your spin attacks. The only issue I have with this fight is how absurdly easy it is. It feels like a massive step down in difficulty compared to both Manhandla and Gleeok, which is a shame since this is one of the only original bosses in this game, rather than being a reused or adapted one from a previous Zelda game. The concept, I think, is solid. It's just that Medusa Head dies so fast. Granted, I do have both the level 2 sword and a red ring, so that contributes for sure. But still, once you have their attack patterns figured out, it's honestly really easy to just avoid taking hits, whether that be by avoiding their attacks with the cape or by blocking them with your shield, which by the way, if you get petrified while holding your shield out, it still works to passively block their attacks, which is just funny. It's too bad though, I think there was a lot of potential here with this battle, but unfortunately, it strikes me as a bit underwhelming compared to how fun most of the previous fights have been. It's not like it's anglerfish levels of easy, and I do think it's still pretty fun to do, but I'd also rank it lower than most of the other bosses that this game has served served up, and I kind of think Fripolar may have made for a better dungeon boss than mid-boss, but oh well. Once they're defeated, we'll find the changing seasons, the final essence of nature.
Nehru here, Subrosian real estate mogul, and let me ask you one simple question. Are you tired of the sun? Wish you could go outside and enjoy the day without those dang UV rays melting your skin? Tired of that ugly terminant moon staring you down every time you step outside? Do I have the solution for you? Move underground. Welcome to Subrosia, a veritable paradise. There is an endless list of reasons why Subrosia should be the destination for your next vacation, or the permanent home for you to raise a family. For starters, while the world above might be changing seasons every time that green guy swings his rod, it's always the same in Subrosia, extremely hot. There's also lots to do. Dance the night away, dig for ore on the beach, meet the locals, maybe even find love. And of course, relax in our lava hot tubs. And I'm happy to tell you that I have a very exciting piece of property that just came on the market. Welcome to the Sword and Shield Maze. Have you ever wanted to be freezing cold and boiling hot at the exact same time? Don't you love the idea of having to navigate a confusing central turnabout every time you want to get around? This is the perfect piece of property for you, and I'll offer it to you for the low price of one boxed copy of Wand of Gamelon still in plastic.
So, overall, this is a very good dungeon, one of the best in the game. It pretty much perfectly performs that balancing act of iterating upon and evolving old ideas while still introducing new ones. We've got minecarts, treasure chest teases, verticality and spatial awareness puzzles, turnstiles, the works. All familiar elements that get remixed in fun ways here. Plus this whole mechanic of transporting ice to cool magma, which is not something we've seen in this game before. Iteration and innovation rolled into one. The two themes, fire and ice respectively, also feels like a nod to the game at large. Subrosia being Holodrum's lava-filled basement. The dungeon is capped off with the changing seasons themselves being the essence that we recover, the embodiment of the never-ending cycle of nature, changing from winter to spring to summer to fall, and then back to winter endlessly. It's a perfect fit for this dungeon, which has you frequently moving between distinct climates. Worth a mention that this is also the only dungeon in Subrosia instead of the surface world of Holodrum. A few more notes I have. There's a lone pot here in an initially inaccessible part of this room on the west side of floor 1. Later on in the dungeon, we can bomb a wall on the other side to reach here and find a fairy. Fairies are great and all, but for such a well-hidden secret, man is this underwhelming. I would have rather at least have found a ring here. There's a puzzle in the room where we find the dungeon item, which took me way too long to work through. The intended solution is to use the magnetic glove to manipulate this orb from the closed-off section on the south side of the room, move it over to this switch, which extends the bridge so that you can get over there. However, I was pretty sure that you could just squeeze past here if you were careful enough. In fact, I even did so when I streamed the game back in 2024. For whatever reason, I just could not replicate it this time, despite trying repeatedly. Either way, I like the idea of needing to approach a puzzle quite literally from multiple angles, so this is not me trashing the puzzle. There's also this little memory puzzle in which you'll see a ghostly Armos move along a set path in this room, which you'll need to replicate. Your path through here has to match exactly, so be careful you don't get knocked off course by any enemies. It's a neat concept, but not my favorite, I guess. It feels a little out of place, but not too terribly so as to detract from the overall dungeon experience. But it's just a one-off thing, which is probably for the better. There's also this sliding ice block puzzle, and I can already hear the comment section complaining about how much they hate it. Well, here's my spicy hot take. I love this sliding ice block puzzle. I've always loved puzzles of this nature, from the Ice Cavern to Snow Peak Ruins. These are always so fun for me. Once you understand the mechanics of how multiple blocks can interact with each other and how to map the paths out in your head, things can really start clicking into place. It's always so satisfying. In this particular case, place, you need to get all 3 blocks into this nook on the right side of the room. This is one of the best versions of this puzzle we've gotten in the entire series, with the block puzzles from Twilight Princess maybe just narrowly beating it out, but I'm not sure. On the flip side, this icy side-scrolling section feels like it was designed specifically to torture me personally. The setback of slipping down here should be enough, but then they gotta punish you more with blade traps. It's just cruel. Speaking of side-scrolling sections, I will say as far as criticisms go that I do wish that the dungeon had been laid out a little differently, because there are definitely some compromises made to the progression in order to maintain that sword and shield shape, with more disjointed sections than we've seen in the likes of Explorer's Crypt. It's not in a way that is severe enough to hinder my enjoyment of the dungeon, but it is still there to a small degree. But overall, Sword and Shield Maze is a great dungeon. It's multifaceted with its theming, but not in an incoherent way. It all fits together. There's a great sense of escalation with what the game has previously established, but without sacrificing being novel on its own terms. It's full of great little teases. It has a turnstile, a great mid-boss, and memorable set pieces. All the makings of a great dungeon. At the very start of your journey through Holodrum, you may have ventured into the rather simple mini-dungeon known as the Hero's Cave. If you're playing through Oracle of Seasons before Oracle of Ages, as I've been doing for these videos, this would have served as a simple tutorial area containing a handful of rudimentary puzzles, before ultimately rewarding you with the level 1 sword and maybe some cash if you go for it. However, if you are tackling Oracle of Seasons second, then the Hero's Cave ends up becoming something of a different beast. Rather than an early game tutorial, it instead acts as a late game optional challenge dungeon. So, with that in mind, let's hop into it. Welcome to the Hero's Cave, and to start, I'd like to mention the music and aesthetics real quick. The overall presentation is probably the weakest point of the dungeon. The wall texture is a recolor of that found in Dancing Dragon Dungeon, and the floor tile set is simply lifted from the standard caves that you'll find all around the world of Holodrum, which makes some sense since this is, well, the Hero's Cave. It's just not the most visually interesting. It gets by fine enough, but I guess it feels a bit lacking in character compared to the game's set of main dungeons. The music, meanwhile, is actually the Samasa Desert theme, and I think it actually fits better here between the two locations that share it. The vibe is a good fit. It's a decent enough track as well, a bit repetitive, but it works for me. It's a lot better than the plodding, incidental Hero's Cave theme you'd get before Gnarled Root if you're doing this as a standard, non-linked game. The Hero's Cave stands out among Season's dungeons due to how it positions itself as a puzzle gauntlet in the game that is, well, less puzzle-focused between the two. The lack of action is something of a rarity in this game. There isn't even a dungeon boss at the end of this. This isn't remotely a bad thing, it's just that the tonal shift is very noticeable. Not to say that there's no combat whatsoever. In fact, there's a couple of rooms pretty much dedicated to it, with one containing waves of enemies that spawn in with each press of a switch in here, with holding the small key until after you defeat them. Another room is flooded, encouraging players to fight using long-ranged weapons, which is a nice change of pace from the game primarily leaning on your sword. So there's all of that and a handful of other minor enemies around the place to keep individual rooms just a little more interesting. So it's not totally devoid of action. That just isn't the focus here. I like it though, and that it takes the time to pretty well put your entire arsenal of items to use. It is also the most linear dungeon by a
long shot, Onox's castle notwithstanding, with quite literally no needed backtracking to previous sections once you've completed the challenge in that area. There's even included checkpoints that will warp you to and from the entrance if you decide you need to dip out for some reason or another, whether that be to get the sword upgrade made available by an NPC in here, or because you came in too early and need to return with an item you don't yet have, like I did repeatedly the first time I ever played this game. So yeah, Puzzle Gauntlet is what I'm going with here to describe the Hero's Cave. And you know what? I like that. I like my puzzles in Zelda. I like them a lot. The puzzles in here are also some of the game's most creative, often feeling like an item use case being pushed to its most logical extreme. The rather controversial power bracelet especially getting a lot of chances to shine. It's just a little unfortunate that the pacing isn't always the best optimized. The puzzle that I found to be the most difficult in here was actually the very first one, which involves pushing around both clay pots and the blocks in the room in order to keep the two switches pressed down, which in turn opens the door. Conceptually simple, but the restrictions in here, the limited space and the fact that you can only push blocks rather than pull them, ends up making this quite a brain tease. It's one of those puzzles where the general concept is pretty easily communicated, but the exact solution takes some experimentation and working through. There's also a few rooms that I'd describe more as obstacle courses than puzzles, making frequent use of your Rock's Feather and later Cape. Some of my least favorite puzzles in here, however, are the ones that make use of your magical boomerang. This one with the moving gem switches isn't too bad, but there's this one with a narrow passageway, which you must navigate the boomerang through. This sort of thing wouldn't be so bad if it used the control scheme of later Zelda titles, but the narrowness of this passageway combined with the speed of the boomerang makes this one fairly frustrating to do in earnest. I frankly ended up just cheesing it. Oops. My favorite puzzle of the Hero's Cave is this one, which acts as something of a sequel to that very first puzzle, this time requiring 4 switches to be pressed down. You've got to push blocks around to make pads for yourself to push the pots through and onto the switches. Doing so will require you to break some of the pots, but you've got to restrain yourself so as to not break too many of them. The limitation of only being able to push and not pull these, nor being able to simply pick up and carry them, really sets this puzzle up as one that you have to be careful and meticulous about. And I mean that in the best way. It feels rewarding to experiment with different pieces, reset the room, try new things out, and then ultimately put your plan into motion. The very final puzzle is in some ways a follow-up to a puzzle found in Unicorn's Cave. 8 treasure chests spawn within this room, and the old man tells you to open the chests in the proper order, with their locations acting as a clue. This is something of a meta puzzle. The room layout, including the flooding in here, is meant to represent the world map, with the treasure chests corresponding to the dungeon locations. In order to pass this last trial, you must open the chests in the order of the dungeon's numbering, counting Dancing Dragon Dungeon as the 4th and Unicorn's Cave as the 5th, mind you. An issue I have with the puzzle is that one of the dungeons, Sword and Shield Maze, is found in Subrosia, not Holodrum. To compensate for this, they've placed it in the position of the Temple of Seasons ruins, which does contain the portal that will take you there, but isn't where the actual dungeon is. That small issue aside, I think this is a really cool puzzle concept. After this, you'll be rewarded with the Power Ring level 3, which is not a half-bad reward, though not a ring I'd prioritize over simply having the red or blue ring. So overall, this version of the Hero's Cave is a fun little side adventure, one with some superbly creative puzzles. The way it puts all of the main dungeon items to use, builds and iterates upon puzzle ideas, reviewing everything you've learned, rewarding you for your efforts, and ultimately capping off with a big meta puzzle like this makes it feel like something of a celebration of the entire game itself. It may pale in comparison to some of the other late game dungeons, but as an optional side thing, it does the job extremely well.
done it. We've found all 8 essences of nature, which has allowed the Maku tree to grow a powerful seed, which he in turn gifts to us. With this seed, we can pierce through the dark magic protecting Onox's castle and approach the end game. So, spoilers ahead, and let's get into it. The castle itself is nothing incredible. In fact, here's the entire dungeon map. It spans all of 8 rooms, boss arena included. These 2 side chambers are optional rooms to grab a fairy, and there are no real puzzles to be had here. Instead, you're just pushing through rooms filled with enemies. This includes Wizrobes, Darknuts, some Wallmasters, and even a quick reappearance of Facade, who dies as easily as you remember. As much as I would have liked for more here, it doesn't really need to be more than this. It acts as a dramatic build-up towards the boss. That's all it is trying to be, and it does achieve that well. Without any unique puzzle mechanics of its own to lean on, drawing out the castle more than this may cause it to somewhat overstay its welcome, so it works. The aesthetics here do the trick too. I like the bricks, the very man-made feeling, and these swords on the wall look rad. The music is pretty much perfect here too. It's sort of mysterious and tense without being all that bombastic or over the top, restraining itself, saving the energy for when we actually confront Onox. And confront him we will. Onox is a great final boss, a giant armored absolute unit of an opponent. This guy is like the ball and chain soldiers cranked up to 11. He looks great. His sprite is detailed enough, but his character art really sells me on this guy. He reminds me a lot of the N64 depictions of Iron Knuckles, a favorite enemy of mine. He's physically imposing, just a big guy. Even the sound of his footsteps portrays just how heavy and strong he is. There's 3 phases to the fight itself. The first and easiest one requires you to avoid his attacks and smack him around with your own spin attacks. Anything less will deal no damage. Simple enough though. The second phase is more of the same, except he will also use Din, still trapped in that crystal from the start of the game, as a human shield. That's pretty cruel, man. You've got to avoid hitting her, as that will actually deal the damage back to you. Easiest way to go about that is to use the Rod of Seasons itself to knock her crystal out of the way so that you can get close enough to Onox to hit him. Good stuff, if not a bit obtuse. The third phase is my favorite. You'll get a short psych out moment where you think you've won, only for the floor to collapse beneath you and drop you into the arena below. Here, in the dark, Onox will reveal his true form, a colossal dark dragon, and he looks awesome. You almost forget that this is a Game Boy Color sprite. He looks so good. As a quick side note, this is also the only phase of the battle that uses its own unique battle music. Well, sort of unique. It has an equivalent appearance in Oracle of Ages as well, but I digress. In terms of just this game, it is unique. The first 2 phases used the usual boss theme, but this one gives us something a little different, and I like it a lot. It's not the most incredible piece of battle music, but it's a welcome change of pace after getting the same boss theme 9 times in a row. As a dragon, Onox will attack by shooting fire at you, as one would expect, as well as by using his massive claws. You've got to avoid these attacks, stay alive, then when he slams one of his hands down, you can jump on top of it to use as a platform and reach the big gem weak spot on his forehead. In premise, pretty simple, but this fight is less about figuring out the weak point and more about doing, about trusting your reflexes and acting quickly. I recommend coming in with a potion ready, as there's a good chance of him depleting your hearts. Some of these attacks are just so tricky to avoid, so if you want to come out the victor, you must manage your timing and strike when the opportunity presents itself. Man, what a great fight. I am quite fond of this one. It manages to achieve being a fairly challenging final boss, as well as a big climactic spectacle at the same time. Plus, who doesn't love to fight a dragon?
With enough hits to the face, eventually Onox will go down. Din will be freed, and with the Oracle back, the seasons of Holodrum will be stabilized. So, this is a wrap on the dungeons of Oracle of Seasons. What a great finale, and what a charming little adventure this has been. I went into this series with a small bit of bias. Seasons is one half of a duology, and while I have always liked it, I always had a preference towards the puzzle-focused Oracle of Ages, but after giving this game a thorough examination, it has only made me love it more. This game is nothing short of an excellent Zelda title, one that tests your reflexes and understanding of space, as well as puts your sense of exploration and curiosity to use. It has been an absolute pleasure to put under the microscope. The more I look at it, the more I appreciate it and what it could achieve. That said, despite the fact that we saved Holodrum, the plans of Twinrova are already in motion, the flame of destruction already lit. So, with the dungeons of Oracle of Seasons concluded, we must venture to the land of Labrina to examine the dungeon design of Oracle of Ages. Until then, thank you so much for watching. A quick shout out to my friend Nehru for joining me in this video to talk about Sword and Shield Maze. An additional thanks to Wolflink's Shadow for producing several pieces of music for me, including the cover of Tarm Ruins, Dancing Dragon Dungeon, the boss battle theme, and some as of yet unveiled pieces that you'll hear in my videos about Oracle of Ages. Go check the links in the description to find their channels for more great Zelda content. Finally, of course, special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon, the names of which have been scrolling by on screen. You all are awesome. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.